I returned home early from a long business trip, expecting the warm embrace of my wife. Instead, I found her bleeding on the kitchen floor with my own son-in-law standing over her, his fists clenched. The rage that exploded inside me could have burned a city to ashes. But I am not a man who acts on blind fury. I am a man who builds empires from dirt. I decided right then that he would not just pay for what he did. He would be systematically dismantled until he had absolutely nothing left. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family abusers deserve no mercy. My name is Hollis. I am 69 years old and I built a multi-million-dollar logistics company with my bare hands. But all my wealth meant nothing in the exact moment I pushed open my own front door. The heavy oak door swung open and the silence in my house felt instantly wrong. There was no smell of dinner cooking on the stove. There was no soft jazz playing from the living room, just a heavy, suffocating tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I dropped my leather travel bag in the hallway and walked straight toward the kitchen. The sight that greeted me froze the blood in my veins. Corinne, my beautiful wife of 40 years, lay crumpled on the cold marble floor. Her hands were clutching her chest and a dark, angry bruise was already forming on her left cheek. A thin line of blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, staining the pristine white tiles. Standing directly above her, breathing heavily with wild bloodshot eyes, was Bradley. He was a 38-year-old financial director. He was a man clothed in expensive tailored suits and a polished corporate smile. But in that moment, the mask was entirely gone. He looked like a cornered animal. He looked down at my wife with pure, unchecked disgust. He did not hear me approach. He did not sense the absolute storm of violence gathering behind him. I did not yell. I did not ask what happened. A man who builds a trucking empire from the ground up knows when words are useless. I crossed the kitchen in 3 massive strides. Bradley turned his head just a second too late. I grabbed him by the lapels of his designer jacket, lifted his entire body off his feet, and slammed him backward into the stainless steel refrigerator. The heavy impact rattled the kitchen cabinets. He gasped for air, his eyes wide with sudden terror. I did not let him breathe. I threw him to the floor, my knee pressing forcefully into his chest, pinning him down. My hands calloused from decades of loading freight before I ever wore a tailored suit wrapped securely around his throat. I was 69 years old, but sheer fury gave me the strength of a man half my age. Bradley clawed desperately at my wrists, his face turning a blotchy shade of purple. I squeezed harder, looking into his terrified eyes, wanting nothing more than to end his miserable existence right there on my kitchen tiles. The shrill sound of police sirens cut through the quiet neighborhood, followed immediately by heavy pounding on my front door. Someone, likely a neighbor, hearing the violent commotion, had called emergency services. 2 uniformed officers rushed into the kitchen with their hands hovering cautiously near their holsters. They shouted firm commands, ordering me to step back and raise my hands in the air. I released my iron grip on Bradley, standing up slowly. My breathing was heavy, but completely controlled. I raised my hands to show immediate compliance. The moment the officers stepped between us, Bradley underwent a sickening transformation. The terrified, violent predator vanished completely. In his place stood the ultimate victim. He scrambled to his feet, adjusting his ruined suit jacket, gasping dramatically for air and putting on a masterclass in deception. He used his corporate charm, his highly articulate voice, and his undeniable white privilege to instantly control the narrative in the room. "Officer, thank God you are here," he coughed, leaning heavily against the counter as if he could barely stand upright. "I came over to check on my mother-in-law. She had a terrible dizzy spell and collapsed, hitting her head. I was trying to help her up when Hollis barged in. He is severely confused. He is getting older and his mind plays dangerous tricks on him. He just attacked me completely unprovoked." I stood there in absolute silence. The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. He was actually trying to convince the police that Corinne fell on her own and that I was suffering from some kind of age-induced violent dementia. I looked at the younger officer. He was already writing quickly in his notepad, nodding sympathetically at Bradley. Bradley spoke their language perfectly. He looked exactly like them. He looked like a respectful, affluent citizen who had just been brutally assaulted by an unstable, older black man. I did not argue with the officers. I did not shout or curse. I simply pointed a steady finger toward my wife. "Ask her," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and utterly devoid of emotion. "Do not listen to him. Do not listen to me. Ask the woman bleeding on the floor. She will tell you exactly how she got that deep bruise on her face. The older officer approached Corinne, kneeling gently beside her with a medical flashlight. Paramedics were already walking through the front door carrying their heavy trauma kits. I watched Corinne closely. My heart physically ached seeing her in such severe pain. This was the woman who had stood firmly by my side when I had nothing but a rusted delivery truck and a massive mountain of debt. She was the unshakable foundation of our entire family. She was a woman of immense grace and quiet, enduring strength. I knew her better than I knew my own soul. I waited patiently for her to point a trembling finger directly at Bradley. I waited for her to declare him a violent monster. I waited for the police officers to turn around, read him his rights, and drag him out of my house in heavy iron chains. Bradley stood completely still by the counter. I could see a cold bead of sweat slowly rolling down his temple. He was staring intensely at Corinne, his jaw clenched tight. It was a silent, threatening glare. He knew that one single word from her would permanently destroy his pristine reputation, his lucrative career, and his freedom. The entire room held its collective breath. The paramedics paused their movements. The officers waited with their pens hovering over their notepads. I took a step closer to my wife, offering her my hand to help her up, offering her the absolute safety of my presence. "Tell them the truth, Corinne," I urged her softly. "Tell them exactly what this coward did to you. Do not be afraid. I am right here. I will not let him touch you ever again." Corinne slowly lifted her heavy head. Her dark eyes finally met mine, and what I saw in them shattered my entire reality. I expected to see pain or anger or profound relief. Instead, I saw absolute paralyzing terror. But she was not looking at Bradley. She was looking directly at me, silently begging me to stop pushing the issue. She reached out with a violently trembling hand and gripped the fabric of my sleeve so tightly her knuckles turned pale white. Her breathing was ragged as she turned her bruised, swollen face toward the waiting police officers. "I fell," she whispered, her voice cracking pathetically. "It was just a dizzy spell. I hit my face hard on the edge of the granite counter. Bradley was only trying to help me up. My husband just misunderstood the situation. The world around me stopped spinning entirely. The air violently left my lungs." The officers nodded, closing their notepads, their underlying suspicions seemingly confirmed. Bradley let out a long, deliberate sigh of relief, offering a sad, patronizing smile. Why was she protecting the monster who had just beaten her? The sterile smell of iodine and bleach in the emergency room offered absolutely no comfort. The medical staff had just finished examining Corinne, confirming 2 cracked ribs and a severe facial fracture. Once the doctors finally left the private room, I walked over and locked the heavy wooden door behind them. I pulled a plastic chair close to her bed and took her small, fragile hand in my large, calloused ones. I did not speak immediately. I just looked into her swollen eyes, waiting for the absolute truth. Corinne stared at the crisp white hospital bedsheets, refusing to meet my intense gaze. I squeezed her hand gently but with undeniable firmness. "Tell me," I commanded softly. "Why did you protect the man who put you in this hospital bed? Tell me right now before I drive back to that house and tear him apart with my bare hands." Corinne let out a choked sob. Her whole body trembled under the thin hospital blanket. Tears streamed down her unbruised cheek, falling onto my knuckles. She squeezed her eyes shut and confessed the sickening reality. "It was Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking under the heavy weight of her fear. "Bradley told me exactly what he would do if I called the police or told you the truth. He said he already had passports prepared and hidden away. He told me he would take our 5-year-old grandson, Leo, and fly him to an overseas territory where American custody laws simply do not apply. He whispered it in my ear right before you walked through the kitchen door. He said Camille would never see her son again and we would die without ever knowing if our grandson was safe. He bragged that he had the financial resources to vanish completely and leave us with nothing but a useless missing child report. The sheer cruelty of his calculated blackmail hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Bradley knew he could never beat me in a fair physical fight. He knew he could never outsmart me in a direct confrontation. So he had weaponized the single most precious thing in our entire world. He used an innocent 5-year-old boy as a human shield to beat my wife and walk away completely untouched by the law. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth physically ached. The puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping into a horrifying picture. I closed my eyes and let a long, slow breath escape my lungs to steady my racing heart. I remembered the exact reason I built my empire in the first place. 47 years ago, I was a young black man with nothing to my name but a rusted second-hand delivery truck and a massive mountain of unpaid bills. I worked 20-hour shifts, hauling heavy freight across state lines, sleeping in the freezing cab of my truck, and eating cold soup from a tin can. I endured the brutal prejudice of the industry because I swore my future family would never know the bitter taste of poverty or the crushing weight of powerlessness. I transformed one broken-down rig into a massive logistics fleet of 500 trucks dominating shipping routes across the entire country. I built an iron fortress of wealth to protect women like Corinne and our daughter Camille. Then Bradley entered our lives. He was a polished white financial executive with an Ivy League degree and a perfectly practiced corporate smile. On paper, he was the ideal match for my daughter. But I always saw the subtle, insidious cracks in his charming facade. I remembered the family Thanksgiving dinners where he would stare at my grease-scarred hands with a thinly veiled smirk. I remembered the constant microaggressions and his condescending remarks about how the modern corporate world required sophisticated wealth management rather than old-school brute force. He looked at me and did not see a highly successful, self-made millionaire. He merely saw an uneducated laborer who had gotten lucky. He deeply believed my wealth rightfully belonged in the hands of someone with his elite background, his skin color, and his supposed pedigree. He had always despised my absolute authority over the family wealth and business. Now he was finally making his move to claim what he believed was his. I opened my eyes and looked down at my resting wife. The blinding red rage that had consumed me in the kitchen was entirely gone. In its place was a freezing, absolute clarity that only comes to a man who has fought for survival his entire life. A street brawler fights with his fists and inevitably ends up locked in a concrete prison cell. A true corporate kingpin fights with leverage strategy and total financial annihilation. I leaned down and kissed Corinne softly on her forehead right above her fresh medical bandages. I will not let him touch Leo. I promised, my voice remarkably steady and completely devoid of panic, and I will not let him get away with this. But I cannot do it with my fists, Corinne. If I assault him now, he will execute his threat and disappear with our grandson. I have to dismantle him the exact same way I dismantle a rival logistics company. I will systematically strip away his armor, cut off his financial supply lines, and leave him begging for a mercy he will never receive. Corinne nodded slowly, the absolute terror in her eyes finally giving way to a small flicker of trust. I told her to rest and recover her strength. I explained that I needed to return to our house to pack her an overnight bag, grab her essential daily medications, and secure our home from any further intrusion. I walked out of the bright hospital room with a singular, deadly focus. Bradley thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against an emotional old man. He did not realize he had just declared an all-out war against a titan. I drove through the dark city streets, my mind already calculating legal loopholes, asset freezes, and the absolute destruction of his prestigious career. I pulled into my driveway, fully expecting to find the house exactly as I left it. The heavy front door was unlocked. I stepped inside, moving quietly through the dark hallway past the kitchen where the dark bloodstains remained untouched on the white marble floor. I headed straight down the corridor toward my private study to retrieve Corinne health insurance documents from my desk. As I approached, I immediately noticed the heavy mahogany door was pushed slightly ajar. A cold sense of pure dread washed over me. I pushed the door open and flipped the bright overhead light switch. The large Persian rug in the center of the room had been forcefully shoved aside, exposing the heavy steel floor safe hidden beneath the floorboards. I dropped to my knees, staring in absolute disbelief. The industrial locking mechanism had been brutally drilled, completely destroyed by heavy-duty power tools. The thick metal door swung open loosely on its damaged hinges. I reached my trembling hand into the dark steel cavity. It was completely empty. The master deeds, the voting shares, and the absolute ownership documents of my entire multi-million-dollar logistics company had vanished without a single trace. I stood perfectly still in the center of my violated study, staring into the hollow belly of the destroyed safe. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled over me like a suffocating winter chill. I did not waste time staring at the empty metal box or mourning the loss of the physical documents. A man who controls a logistics empire does not weep over stolen paper. He immediately identifies the leak and neutralizes the threat. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed my daughter. Camille picked up on the second ring. I did not offer a warm greeting or cushion the blow. I commanded her to get to the house immediately because there was a severe family emergency. I hung up before she could ask any questions or formulate an excuse. 20 minutes later, I heard the heavy front door swing open. I walked out of the study and found Camille standing in the hallway. She was 35 years old, dressed in a tailored beige trench coat, clutching her expensive leather handbag. I expected to see genuine panic in her eyes. I expected her to frantically ask what was wrong or where her mother was. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and looked at me with a defensive, hardened glare. "Bradley called me," she said, her voice tight and completely devoid of empathy. "He told me everything that happened. Dad, you need to calm down and stop acting so erratically." I stared at my own flesh and blood, genuinely unable to comprehend her words. "Your mother is currently lying in a hospital bed with 2 cracked ribs and a fractured face," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "Your husband beat her until she bled on our kitchen floor." Camille rolled her eyes, letting out a heavy, exasperated sigh as if she were dealing with a petulant child. "That is exactly what Bradley meant," she replied, shaking her head. "He said you would spin a crazy, paranoid story. Mom had a dizzy spell and fell. Bradley was just trying to help her up when you barged in and attacked him like a violent thug. Dad, you cannot just assault people because your mind is playing tricks on you." The absolute absurdity of her statement hit me like a physical blow. She was looking at me not as a father who had provided her with an exceptional life, but as a dangerous, confused old man. Bradley had not just beaten my wife and robbed my safe. He had completely infiltrated my daughter's mind and poisoned her against her own parents. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her and pointed a steady finger toward my ruined study. "Did your husband also tell you that he broke into my private office and stole the ownership deeds to my entire logistics company?" I asked. Camille did not gasp. She did not look shocked or horrified by the accusation. A brief flicker of guilt crossed her features, but she quickly masked it with stubborn defiance. I gave him the access code to the security system, she admitted, lifting her chin to challenge my authority. He had to drill the physical lock because you stubbornly refused to share the master combination with anyone. He did not steal anything, Dad. He is simply securing the assets to protect our family future. Securing the assets, I repeated, the sterile corporate buzzword tasting like ash in my mouth. You helped him bypass my security so he could rob me blind. She uncrossed her arms and took a step forward, echoing the exact manipulative talking points Bradley had clearly drilled into her head for months. "Dad, you have to face reality," she said, her tone shifting to a sickeningly sweet, patronizing cadence. "Your memory is failing. You are making poor business decisions. Bradley consulted with specialists and he said you are showing undeniable signs of severe age-induced dementia. The company is going to go bankrupt if you stay in charge. He is taking over the administrative burden so you can finally rest. He is saving the business." I looked at the daughter I had raised, the girl I had put through elite universities and paid for her lavish wedding. She was completely brainwashed. Bradley had systematically isolated her, feeding her a continuous diet of lies about my mental competence. He preyed on her underlying anxieties and convinced her that stripping me of my life work was an act of profound mercy. He was using her absolute blind loyalty to him as a weapon against her own family. He had taken the immense wealth I built from nothing and convinced my own heir that I was no longer fit to manage it. "You are being played, Camille," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "Bradley does not care about your future. He does not care about this company. He cares about cashing out my empire to fund his own pathetic greed. He assaulted your mother to keep her quiet, and now he is using you as an eager accomplice to corporate theft." I expected my words to penetrate the thick fog of manipulation clouding her judgment. I expected a daughter natural instinct to defend her injured mother to finally kick in and break the spell. Instead, she backed away from me, shaking her head in profound disappointment. "You are completely delusional, Dad," she muttered, turning her back on me and reaching for the front door handle. "I am not going to stand here and listen to you slander my husband. He is the only one trying to keep this family from falling apart." She opened the door and walked out, leaving me standing alone in the silent hallway. I realized in that exact moment that reasoning with her was a complete waste of time. Words would never break the psychological hold Bradley had over her. She was a deeply dependent hostage who had tragically fallen in love with her captor. I turned my back on the front door and walked straight into my study. If I could not save my daughter with the truth, I would have to destroy her husband with the crushing weight of the law. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I navigated to my contacts and prepared to call Thorne, my ruthless, long-time corporate attorney. I was going to instruct Thorne to immediately freeze every single corporate asset, invalidate the stolen deeds, and report a multi-million-dollar grand theft to the local authorities. I was going to bury Bradley under a mountain of federal charges so deep he would never see the light of day again. My thumb hovered directly over the call button when my phone vibrated violently in my hand. A high-priority digital alert flashed across the bright screen from my private corporate banking application. I opened the notification and the blood drained instantly from my face. A massive wire transfer had just been executed in real time. $2 million in liquid operating funds had been completely drained from the logistics company primary account and funneled into an untraceable offshore blind trust. It was an apocalyptic financial blow that would paralyze my shipping operations by morning. But the missing money was not what made my heart stop beating. I stared at the digital receipt, carefully examining the finalized authorization credential at the bottom of the screen. The transfer was not authorized by Bradley. The digital signature prominently displayed on the fraudulent wire transfer belonged exclusively to Camille. The brilliant, sickening trap slammed shut around me. Bradley had not just stolen my money. He had weaponized my own daughter to pull the trigger and execute the theft. If I called the police or the federal authorities right now to report the missing funds, the irrefutable paper trail would lead directly to Camille. Sending the man who beat my wife to a federal penitentiary meant I would have to send my only child to prison right alongside him. I lowered my phone. The furious urge to call the authorities died instantly in my throat. I could not trigger a massive legal investigation that would inevitably put my own daughter in a federal penitentiary. Bradley knew exactly what he was doing. He had constructed a flawless hostage situation using Camille as his ultimate human shield. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing air of my violated study clear my mind. A true kingpin does not panic when outflanked. He simply changes the entire battlefield. I opened my contacts and dialed Bradley's number. He answered on the first ring, undoubtedly expecting a barrage of screaming threats and wild accusations. I did not yell. I did not demand my money back. I let my shoulders slump physically, forcing my body into a posture of defeat. I made my voice crack, adding a heavy layer of exhaustion and age to my tone. I told him he won. I told him to come back to the house alone right now so we could discuss the transition of power. Less than an hour later, his sleek silver sports car pulled aggressively into my driveway. He walked through the front door with a confident swagger, a victorious smirk plastered across his pristine face. I met him in the living room, sitting deep in my leather armchair. I did not rise to greet him. I let my posture appear incredibly weak, my hands resting loosely on my knees. I looked at him like a man who had finally surrendered to the inevitable crush of time. He stood over me, adjusting his expensive cuffs, thoroughly enjoying the power dynamic. "You called for me, Hollis?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. I kept my eyes lowered to the floor. I told him I saw the massive wire transfer. I told him I understood exactly what he did with Camille's signature and how perfectly he had trapped me. I admitted that I was cornered and that I had absolutely no fight left in my bones. I played the exact role he had written for me, a tired, broken old black man who realized he had finally lost his grip on the complex modern world. Bradley paced slowly across my living room floor, soaking in his perceived victory. He looked around at the expensive artwork and the custom mahogany furniture with the greedy eyes of a conqueror claiming his spoils. "It is nothing personal, Hollis," he said, leaning casually against the mantel of my fireplace. "It is simply the natural evolution of business. You built something impressive for a guy with your background, driving trucks, hauling cargo, sweating in the dirt. It is a cute American dream story, but that era is completely over." He crossed his arms, looking down his nose at me with a sickening level of superiority. "You do not understand modern corporate finance. You run a multi-million-dollar logistics network like a neighborhood corner store. It takes a certain level of education, a specific type of sophisticated pedigree to elevate this company to the global level. You simply do not have the intellectual capacity or the right societal connections to sit at the adults' table anymore. The world belongs to educated men like me now." Every word he spoke was heavily laced with a quiet, insidious racism. He was practically patting me on the head, telling me I had done a good job for someone of my kind, but it was time to hand the keys over to the white savior with the Ivy League degree. I sat there and swallowed the bitter bile rising in my throat. I remembered the decades of backbreaking labor. I remembered negotiating contracts with cutthroat executives who looked exactly like Bradley men who smiled in my face while desperately trying to bankrupt me. I beat every single one of them by letting them underestimate my intelligence. Bradley was making the exact same fatal mistake. He honestly believed his expensive piece of paper from a fancy university made him smarter than a man who had survived the absolute trenches of the industry. He thought his financial trickery was a work of sheer genius. I let him talk. I let him inflate his own ego until it was completely ready to burst. I looked up at him, maintaining my flawless facade of absolute defeat. "You win, Bradley," I said, my voice quiet and deeply resigned. "You have the master deeds. You have the money safely secured offshore. You have Camille convinced that I am losing my mind and completely unfit to run my own company. I am too old and too tired to fight a brutal war that will only end up putting my daughter in a prison cell. I will step down without a fight. I will announce my immediate retirement at the board meeting next week. I will officially hand over the position of Chief Executive Officer directly to you." Bradley's eyes widened, slightly gleaming with unrestrained greed. He had coveted that exact title since the day he married my daughter. "But I have one strict condition," I continued, leaning forward slightly to show my desperation. "You leave Corinne alone. You never lay a single hand on my wife ever again. You treat Camille well, and you keep Leo safe. You take your position, you take the entire company, and you let me live out my remaining years in peace taking care of Corinne. If you agree to this, I will sign the transition papers quietly and disappear from the corporate structure forever." Bradley smiled a terrifyingly arrogant grin. He walked over and patted me condescendingly on the shoulder like a master praising a defeated dog. "That is a very smart decision, Hollis. You go take care of Corinne. Enjoy your quiet retirement. I will take excellent care of the empire." He turned around and walked out the front door, whistling a cheerful tune. He stepped into his sports car and sped away, completely convinced he had just conquered a titan without breaking a single sweat. He thought he had successfully cornered the king and claimed the crown forever. The heavy front door clicked shut. The absolute second the lock engaged, the defeated slump vanished entirely from my shoulders. My posture straightened into a rigid line of steel. My face hardened into a cold mask of pure execution. I was not a tired old man. I was a predator who had just baited the perfect trap. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was Thorne, my ruthless longtime corporate attorney. He answered immediately, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Thorne," I said, my voice sharp and commanding, completely stripped of any previous weakness. "Listen to me very carefully. I do not need you to draft divorce papers for my daughter today. I do not need you to file a useless local police report about a break-in. I need you to reach out to your top contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need a direct, secure line to the director of the Financial Crimes Division. It is time to initiate a federal hunt." I drove straight to the towering glass skyscraper downtown that housed the law firm Thorne operated. I bypassed the receptionist and walked directly into his secure private conference room. Thorne was already waiting for me alongside a man I had never met. The stranger was built like a cinder block with cold, calculating eyes and a neutral expression. Thorne introduced him as Vance, a former federal agent who now ran the most elite private investigation firm in the city. There were no polite greetings or offers of coffee. We were men preparing for a war, and we did not have time for pleasantries. Vance slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany table. He opened it and laid out a series of highly classified banking records highlighting a complex web of transactions. The $2 million Bradley had stolen using my daughter's signature had not simply rested in an offshore blind trust to protect the company from my supposed dementia. It had touched the trust for less than an hour before being aggressively fragmented. Vance traced the money as it bounced through 4 different anonymous shell companies designed specifically to wash the funds and erase the digital trail. It was a textbook money laundering operation. Bradley was not securing family assets. He was liquidating my life work to cover tracks I did not even know existed. I stared at the highlighted bank statements, feeling a cold sense of validation. I knew Bradley was a snake, but the sheer scale of his immediate theft proved he was operating with intense desperation. A man does not risk a massive wire fraud charge unless a larger threat is breathing down his neck. Vance pulled a second stack of documents from the folder. These were not banking records. They were surveillance photographs and underground ledger printouts. Bradley was not the sophisticated financial genius he pretended to be at country club dinners. He was a degenerate gambler, heavily addicted to high-stakes sports betting. According to Vance, my son-in-law had accumulated a catastrophic mountain of debt with a brutal underground betting syndicate. These were not the type of men who sent collection letters. They were the type of men who broke kneecaps and threatened families. Over $1.5 million of my stolen corporate funds went directly into a shadow account controlled by this exact syndicate. Bradley had literally used the money I bled for to save his own life from loan sharks. But the betrayal did not end with his pathetic gambling addiction. Vance slid a final photograph across the glass table. It showed Bradley standing outside an exclusive luxury car dealership. He was not alone. He was passionately kissing a young blonde woman who was definitely not my daughter. Vance explained that Bradley had used a significant portion of the remaining stolen funds to purchase a brand new luxury sports car entirely in cash for his secret mistress. He had set her up in an expensive downtown penthouse, paying a full year of rent in advance. I stared at the glossy photograph of the man who had just beaten my wife, funding his sordid double life with my money. My daughter was fiercely defending a monster who was systematically robbing her blind to pay off criminals and entertain a mistress. Thorne leaned forward, tapping a heavy gold pen against the table. "We take this to Camille right now," Thorne urged, his voice thick with legal aggression. "You show her the gambling debts. You show her the mistress. We break his psychological hold over her tonight. Then she willingly testifies against him for the wire fraud, and we bury him." It was the logical legal strategy. But I slowly shook my head. I pushed the photograph of the mistress back across the table. "No," I said, my voice dead and absolute. "We do not show her a single piece of this evidence." Thorne stared at me in profound confusion, but I understood something he did not. I understood the devastating psychology of a manipulated victim. Camille had been isolated, gaslighted, and emotionally battered by Bradley for years. Her entire reality was currently dictated by his narrative. If I walked into her house and handed her these photographs, she would not suddenly wake up from her nightmare. Bradley had already convinced her that I was a paranoid, vindictive old man losing my grip on sanity. If I presented this evidence, Bradley would effortlessly spin it. He would look into her eyes and swear I hired someone to manufacture fake photos to ruin their marriage. He would claim the financial ledgers were forged by me to frame him. And Camille, desperately wanting to believe the man she loved, would swallow his lies and dig her heels in even deeper. She would completely sever ties with me to protect him. You cannot break a deep trauma bond by simply handing the victim a stack of paperwork. The victim has to see the monster unmask himself. I needed Bradley to feel so incredibly powerful and untouchable that he became sloppy. I needed him to drop his polished facade and destroy his own narrative right in front of Camille's eyes. I had to orchestrate a scenario where his true violent nature was completely undeniable. Just as I formulated this strategy, Thorne's personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass table. He answered it, listening intently for a few seconds. I watched the blood drain from his face. His expression shifted from aggressive confidence to absolute grim horror. He hung up the phone and looked directly at me. I put a discreet security detail at the hospital to monitor Corinne's recovery room. Thorne said, his voice tight with urgency. "My men just reported a critical incident. Bradley completely bypassed the nursing staff and cornered Corinne alone in her room 10 minutes ago. He forced her to sign a quitclaim deed transferring total ownership of your coastal vacation villa directly into his name." I stood up from my chair, my hands curling into tight fists. Corinne would never willingly hand over our sanctuary to that animal. I demanded to know how he forced her signature. Thorne swallowed hard before delivering the final crushing blow. "He used her younger brother," Thorne explained. "As you know, Corinne's brother is currently on full life support in a specialized care facility. That facility is entirely funded by your corporate accounts, which Bradley now controls. Bradley stood over your injured wife and told her that if she did not sign the villa over to him immediately, he would terminate the corporate funding today. He explicitly threatened to pull the plug and let her brother die." I left Thorne's office and drove to the hospital, breaking every speed limit in the city. The tires of my heavy sedan screeched against the asphalt as I pulled into the emergency parking lot. I sprinted through the automatic doors, bypassing the security desk entirely, and navigated the sterile white corridors with single-minded focus. When I pushed open the door to Corinne recovery room, I found Bradley standing directly over her bed holding a luxury gold pen and a thick stack of legal documents. His face was a mask of cold, ruthless determination. Corinne looked terribly pale, her eyes darting frantically between the heavy paperwork and the door. The heart monitor beside her bed beeped at an elevated, erratic pace reflecting her sheer physical terror. Bradley turned to me, a smug, victorious smile playing on his lips. He clearly thought he had the ultimate leverage. He thought I would scream or throw a wild punch and get myself arrested right there in the hospital ward, playing perfectly into his narrative of a violent, unhinged old man. Instead, I walked slowly to the other side of the bed. I completely ignored his presence, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my anger. I reached down and gently took Corinne's trembling hand in mine. Her skin felt like ice. She looked up at me silently, begging for a way out, for a brilliant plan to save her brother without giving this monster our cherished sanctuary. I leaned down and kissed her bandaged forehead. "Sign the papers, Corinne," I said, my voice smooth and utterly calm. "Sign exactly where he tells you to sign. Give him the coastal villa." Corinne gasped slightly, her grip on my hand tightening until her knuckles turned white. She knew exactly how much that beautiful property meant to us. It was the very first piece of real estate we bought outright after the logistics company became highly profitable. But she also knew me. After 40 years of marriage, she knew I never surrendered without a lethal strategy in place. She looked deep into my eyes, searching for the truth hidden behind my calm exterior. She found the quiet reassurance she needed. Without shedding another tear, she reached out with her bruised arm, took the heavy gold pen from Bradley, and signed her name on every single dotted line. She handed the stack of documents back to him. Bradley snatched them with greedy enthusiasm. He looked at me with triumphant contempt, completely convinced he had broken my spirit and stripped me of my most valuable personal asset. He walked out of the hospital room without uttering another word, leaving us in the quiet, sterile silence. What Bradley did not know was that I had fully anticipated his insatiable greed. The moment he demanded the transition of power at my house, I had instructed Thorne to initiate a highly classified corporate restructuring behind closed doors. The coastal villa was not just a simple residential property sitting on a pristine beach. It was the primary asset held under a subsidiary shell company that we originally used to acquire commercial beachfront real estate many decades ago. Years ago, that specific subsidiary had been subjected to a brutal audit and penalized with a staggering federal tax lien amounting to nearly $4 million. I had deliberately kept that subsidiary dormant, planning to settle the massive tax debt slowly over the next decade using my personal funds. By forcing Corinne to sign that specific quitclaim deed, Bradley had not just stolen a beautiful vacation home with an ocean view. He had legally assumed total ownership of the entire subsidiary and blindly accepted full personal liability for the astronomical federal tax debt attached to it. Thorne had beautifully laced the transition documents with what he called absolute legal poison. Bradley was so thoroughly blinded by his arrogance and his desperate need for immediate liquid cash to pay off his loan sharks that he completely failed to perform even basic corporate due diligence. He did not hire an independent auditor to review the holding company. He did not run a background check on the property identification number or the tax registry. He simply saw a multi-million-dollar mansion and violently grabbed it. He thought he was taking a crown jewel, but he had just swallowed a live financial hand grenade. The moment the federal tax agency registered the transfer of ownership, they would immediately flag his personal accounts for aggressive debt collection. But I knew Bradley would not wait for the tax bill to arrive in the mail. He needed cash to feed his reckless lifestyle and his growing list of criminal demands. The very next morning, Bradley marched directly into a high-end commercial bank in the financial district. Using his polished corporate charm and his newly acquired property deed, he leveraged the coastal villa to secure an immediate short-term commercial loan. He walked out of the bank executive offices with over $2 million in freshly minted credit, completely unaware that he had just committed massive federal bank fraud by using a heavily encumbered asset as clean collateral. Armed with this new influx of stolen wealth, Bradley decided it was time to celebrate his total victory over me. He organized a lavish, extravagant dinner party at the most exclusive country club in the entire city. It was a clear demonstration of power designed to solidify his new status among the local elite and establish himself as the new king of the logistics industry. He invited influential politicians, wealthy socialites, and key figures in the business community who had previously respected me. and in a display of supreme twisted arrogance, he sent a formal invitation to me. He wanted to parade his defeated father-in-law before his new peers. He wanted to show the wealthy world that the old guard had been officially retired and that he was the absolute unquestioned ruler of the empire I had built from the dirt. I did not decline the invitation. I put on my finest custom-tailored tuxedo. I adjusted my silk tie and drove to the country club, carrying myself with the proud, unyielding posture of a reigning king. When I walked into the grand ballroom, the giant crystal chandeliers illuminated a sea of extreme wealth and white privilege. Bradley stood at the center of the massive room, holding a glass of expensive vintage champagne, surrounded by affluent businessmen. When he saw me enter, his eyes lit up with malicious delight. He immediately called for the attention of the room, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The classical orchestra stopped playing and the wealthy guests turned to listen in silence. Bradley raised his glass toward me and delivered a public speech dripping with venomous condescension. He thanked me for finally stepping aside and acknowledging that my outdated primitive methods were no longer sufficient for the modern, highly educated corporate world. He made thinly veiled racist remarks disguised as sophisticated corporate jargon, laughing about how the heavy street lifting was finally over and the superior educated minds were taking the reins to fix my mess. The affluent crowd chuckled softly, sipping their drinks and looking at me with absolute pity. I did not frown. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I offered a wide, generous smile and slowly raised my own glass in a silent, dignified toast to his brilliant speech. What the arrogant fool did not realize was that safely concealed inside the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket, a high-definition digital recording device was currently capturing every single humiliating and discriminatory word with a steady, blinking red light. The morning after the extravagant dinner party at the country club, I did not go home to sleep. While Bradley was sleeping off his expensive vintage champagne, I drove my heavy sedan to a highly secure, windowless boardroom located inside a brutalist industrial building on the very edge of the city. I had secretly summoned the original board of directors for an emergency executive session. These were the men and women who had been with me since the very beginning. They were the grizzled, hardened veterans of the logistics industry who had helped me build my massive empire from a single rusted truck. Bradley arrogantly believed he had quietly dissolved their power when he seized control, but he was entirely ignorant of the true corporate hierarchy and the unbreakable bonds of loyalty I had forged over 4 decades. I walked into the dimly lit room and took my rightful seat at the head of the heavy oak table. I did not look like a defeated old man seeking pity or charity. I looked exactly like the ruthless corporate titan they had served and respected for 40 years. I laid out the entire situation without displaying an ounce of emotion. I explained the coerced transition documents, the massive theft of liquid operating funds, and the immediate lethal threat Bradley posed to the survival of our life work. I told them about the brutal assault on my wife, but I kept my voice as cold and hard as steel. The board members listened in absolute stunned silence. Their loyalty was not to the modern corporate structure or to the polished Ivy League son-in-law who treated them like obsolete dinosaurs. Their absolute loyalty was to me and to the empire we bled for. I placed the fraudulent transition paperwork Bradley had forced me to sign right in the center of the table. I instructed the board that we were not going to file a simple police report or beg for a civil injunction. We were going to execute a total internal corporate purge and completely annihilate his standing. I looked around the room, making strict, unwavering eye contact with every single director. They nodded in unanimous agreement, their faces grim and determined. They were entirely ready to help me drop the executioner blade on Bradley's neck. I signaled for Thorne to enter the boardroom. My ruthless attorney carried a heavy leather briefcase containing the original foundational charter of the logistics company. When I first incorporated this business 40 years ago, the shipping industry was a lawless, ruthless frontier completely plagued by hostile takeovers, forged signatures, and malicious corporate espionage. I was a young, ambitious black man operating in a predominantly white industry, and I knew the corporate sharks would eventually try to steal my empire using deceptive legal paperwork and systemic bias. So I had Thorne's predecessor write an ironclad, absolute failsafe directly into the core DNA of the company charter. It was a secret clause buried deep within hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon. The clause explicitly stated that any transfer of executive power or any movement of corporate assets exceeding $1 million required significantly more than just my physical wet signature. It required my direct biometric fingerprint verification to be considered legally binding. Bradley had stood in my living room and eagerly watched me sign the transition papers with a simple pen. He was so incredibly arrogant and desperate to take my throne that he never thoroughly read the foundational corporate bylaws. He never asked for my fingerprint because he had absolutely no idea the biometric requirement even existed. Therefore, every single document he currently held, every offshore transfer he initiated, and his entire claim to the position of Chief Executive Officer was legally classified as severe corporate fraud. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a digital biometric scanner. I placed my thumb firmly against the glowing green glass. The machine beeped loudly, registering my identity, and officially authorizing the board to initiate an immediate total reversal of all unverified transactions. Bradley's brief and arrogant reign was officially invalidated and entirely erased from the corporate registry. Thorne did not waste a single second implementing our counterattack. Armed with the notarized biometric rejection and the unanimous board resolution, he went straight to the federal financial regulators and our primary commercial banks. The response from the massive financial institutions was instantaneous and absolutely devastating for my son-in-law. The high-end commercial bank that had just issued Bradley the $2 million loan using the encumbered coastal villa received a critical level fraud alert directly from Thorne office. They immediately recognized they had been deeply duped into accepting a highly toxic asset as clean collateral. The bank executives executed an immediate aggressive financial lockdown to protect their institutional liabilities. Every single corporate account Bradley thought he controlled was frozen instantly without any prior warning. His massive executive credit lines were completely severed and permanently deactivated. The fraudulent offshore wire transfer of $2 million was flagged for a severe federal clawback, effectively trapping the stolen money in digital purgatory before the violent underground betting syndicate could extract a single dime. Furthermore, the commercial bank automatically froze Bradley's personal checking and savings accounts, pending a massive internal fraud investigation. He was completely stripped of his financial armor in the blink of an eye. The vast fortune he thought he had successfully stolen evaporated into thin air, leaving him entirely exposed to the brutal consequences of his own monumental greed. I sat back in my comfortable chair at the boardroom, feeling a freezing sense of absolute satisfaction. I had systematically cut off his oxygen supply and destroyed his leverage. The arrogant predator who had brutally beaten my wife and publicly mocked my legacy was now completely financially paralyzed and entirely unaware that his execution was already well underway. Across town, Bradley was living his lavish fantasy, completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse crashing down upon his head. He stood inside an exclusive high-end jewelry store trying to purchase a massive diamond necklace for his secret blonde mistress. He casually handed the cashier his premium platinum corporate credit card with a smug, arrogant smile, expecting absolute deference. The cashier swiped the card. The machine beeped a harsh red warning, "Declined." Bradley frowned sharply, snatching the card back and aggressively handing her his personal black card. The cashier swiped it again. "Declined." The blood rushed to Bradley's face as the cashier looked at him with a mixture of polite suspicion and profound pity. Humiliated and completely enraged in front of his mistress, he stormed out of the expensive boutique, leaving the diamonds behind. He drove his sports car furiously toward the logistics company headquarters, intending to scream at the accounting department and fire whoever blocked his access. He marched aggressively through the automated glass doors, but his executive access badge blinked a solid denying red at the security turnstiles. The elderly black security guard working the front desk calmly informed him that his clearance had been permanently revoked by the board of directors. Bradley absolutely snapped. His polished corporate mask shattered completely, revealing the violent monster underneath. He lunged forward brutally, punching the elderly guard directly in the face and violently smashing the lobby computer monitors into pieces. He raged like a rabid animal, completely unaware that the newly upgraded high-definition security cameras were capturing every single second of his violent, unprovoked federal assault. Bradley drove his sports car back to his suburban estate like a rabid animal fleeing a cage. He slammed the heavy front door shut, the thick glass panes violently rattling in their wooden frames. He was breathing heavily, his silk tie completely undone and his knuckles deeply bruised from his pathetic assault on my elderly security guard. Camille was standing in the center of the pristine living room, nervously holding her cell phone. She was deeply confused and visibly frightened because her own premium credit cards had just been aggressively declined at a local high-end grocery store. She approached him tentatively and asked what was happening. She asked why the bank had suddenly frozen their joint accounts and why he was not answering her calls. Her innocent, anxious questions were the absolute worst possible trigger for a man whose entire fraudulent empire had just imploded into dust. Bradley did not offer his usual charming corporate excuses. The polished, loving husband mask was entirely gone, replaced by a venomous sneer. He marched across the expensive Persian rug and backed his own wife violently into the edge of the glass coffee table. He screamed at her, unleashing a barrage of vile, demeaning insults. He blamed my daughter for being too stupid to secure the transition paperwork properly. He blamed my supposed stubbornness for ruining his perfect life. Camille cowered, physically shrinking away and raising her hands to pacify the man she had blindly defended against me just a few days ago. She begged him to calm down, crying softly and telling him they could just call me to fix the misunderstanding. Hearing my name was the absolute breaking point for his fragile, shattered ego. Bradley raised his hand and swung with all his might. The sharp, sickening crack of his open palm striking Camille directly across the face echoed loudly through the large, empty house. The brutal force of the blow knocked her entirely off balance, sending her crashing hard onto the hardwood floor. She held her burning cheek, her eyes wide with absolute, uncomprehending terror. The man she had worshipped, the man she had betrayed her own family to protect, had just physically struck her. Bradley stood over her, his chest heaving, raising his fist to strike her again. He never got the chance to deliver the second blow. I had fully anticipated his violent, erratic reaction the absolute moment Thorne confirmed the accounts were frozen. I had followed him directly from the corporate headquarters, arriving at his front steps just as he began screaming at my daughter. I did not bother knocking or asking for permission to enter his property. I raised my heavy leather boot and kicked the custom wooden front door directly at the locking mechanism. The expensive door frame splintered violently, the steel deadbolt tearing cleanly through the wood with a deafening crash. I stormed into the living room just as Bradley was preparing to hit my daughter a second time. He snapped his head toward the sudden explosive noise, his eyes wide with a pathetic mixture of shock and lingering rage. I did not speak a single word. I did not offer a grand speech or a demand for his surrender. I simply stepped forward, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat, and pivoted my entire body weight into my right arm. I channeled 40 years of hauling heavy steel freight-loading cargo in freezing rain and surviving the absolute brutal trenches of the logistics industry into one single devastating motion. My fist connected squarely with Bradley's jaw. The sound of his facial bone fracturing was a sharp, deeply satisfying snap. His eyes instantly rolled to the back of his head. His body went entirely limp, lifting slightly off the floor from the sheer kinetic impact before collapsing backward into the glass coffee table, shattering it into 1,000 jagged pieces. He lay there completely unconscious, bleeding heavily from his mouth among the ruined glass. I did not look at him twice. I reached down and gently pulled my trembling daughter off the floor. I yelled for my 5-year-old grandson Leo, who was crying at the top of the stairs. I scooped the terrified boy into my arms, wrapped my free arm tightly around Camille, and marched them straight out of that house of horrors. I drove them directly to a highly secure private safe house I had acquired on the outskirts of the city, a heavily fortified property Bradley did not even know existed. Inside the quiet, safe walls, I set Leo up in a comfortable guest bedroom with a television and locked the door to give the traumatized boy some peace. Then I walked back into the main living room where Camille was sitting on the edge of the sofa, clutching a cold ice pack to her rapidly swelling cheek. She was staring blankly at the floor, still visibly trapped in the devastating shock of domestic violence. She opened her mouth, likely preparing to formulate a pathetic excuse for her husband's sudden violent outburst. She was going to say he was just stressed, that he did not mean it, the classic desperate rationalizations of a deeply abused hostage. I did not give her a single second to build a psychological defense for him. I walked over to the heavy oak dining table and pulled the thick manila folder Vance had given me out of my briefcase. I unceremoniously dumped the entire contents directly in front of her. Dozens of glossy, high-definition surveillance photographs spilled across the wood. I stood silent and watched her dark eyes track over the damning images. She saw Bradley passionately kissing the young blonde woman outside the luxury car dealership. She saw the detailed documentation of the expensive downtown penthouse he rented for his secret mistress. She saw the extensive financial ledgers showing over $1.5 million of my stolen corporate funds being funneled directly to a violent underground sports betting syndicate. I watched her read the itemized cash receipt for the luxury sports car he bought his mistress with the exact same money she had criminally wired to him just a few days ago. The meticulous illusion of her perfect marriage shattered into irreparable pieces right before her eyes. The devastating realization hit her with the crushing, unyielding force of a freight train. Camille dropped the glossy photographs onto the table and buried her face deep in her hands. She let out a guttural, agonizing scream, collapsing completely under the heavy weight of his absolute betrayal. She cried for the years she had blindly wasted, for the mother she had abandoned in a hospital bed, and for the father she had so foolishly betrayed. I stood perfectly still, letting her expel every ounce of weakness and toxic loyalty from her system. The tears flowed heavily, staining the collar of her trench coat. But then, the crying abruptly stopped. The room fell into a dead-heavy silence. Camille slowly lowered her hands and looked directly up at me. The terrified, manipulated victim was completely gone. Her tears had dried, leaving behind a freezing, absolute clarity. I looked into her dark eyes and saw the exact same ruthless, calculating coldness that had built a massive logistics empire from the dirt. She was finally her father-daughter. "I will help you destroy him," she said, her voice completely stripped of emotion. I watched my daughter wipe the last tear from her eye and adjust the collar of her designer trench coat. The fragile, weeping victim I had carried out of that house earlier was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman forged from the exact same iron resolve that had allowed me to conquer the logistics industry. We had spent the last 3 hours inside the secure safe house preparing her for the most dangerous performance of her entire life. She was going back into the wolf den. She was going to walk right back into the arms of the man who had systematically destroyed our family. I pulled my armored sedan to a stop a block away from their sprawling suburban estate. Camille stepped out of the vehicle without a single word of hesitation. She walked up the long paved driveway, projecting the perfect image of a broken, terrified wife returning to her master. I sat in the darkness of my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Sending my only child back into a house with a violent predator went against every natural instinct I possessed as a father. But we were no longer playing defense. We were actively executing a lethal offensive strategy, and Camille was our ultimate Trojan horse. She pushed open the heavy wooden front door that I had violently splintered off its hinges just hours prior. Bradley was sitting in the center of the ruined living room amidst the shattered remains of the glass coffee table. He was holding a bag of frozen peas to his brutally swollen jaw. His face was a vivid canvas of dark purple and black bruises. The single punch I delivered had fractured his jawbone severely, limiting his ability to speak without wincing in sharp pain. When he saw Camille standing in the doorway, his bloodshot eyes widened in absolute shock. He immediately dropped the ice pack and stood up, his defensive instincts kicking in. But Camille did not give him a chance to lash out or ask questions. She dropped her expensive handbag to the floor and immediately collapsed to her knees. She buried her face in her hands and unleashed a torrent of hysterical, highly convincing sobs. She cried out that she was so incredibly sorry. She spun a brilliant, flawless lie, claiming that I had forcefully dragged her to the safe house against her will and locked her inside a room. She told him she had waited for me to turn my back before escaping out a secondary door and running all the way back to him. She crawled across the expensive Persian rug, wrapping her arms around his legs and begging him to forgive her for not fighting me off. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Bradley was a raging, malignant narcissist. His ego was so massively inflated and so deeply dependent on her absolute submission that he blindly swallowed every single word she cried. He could not fathom a reality where the woman he had meticulously broken down for years could ever possess the intelligence or the courage to outsmart him. He reached down and pulled her up into his arms, shushing her gently and playing the role of the benevolent, forgiving savior. Sitting in the back of an unmarked surveillance van parked 3 streets over, I watched the entire sickening reunion unfold in pristine, high-definition video. Beside me, Vance, the former federal agent, was meticulously adjusting the audio frequencies on a massive digital soundboard. Before Camille left the safe house, Vance had equipped her with a piece of classified federal surveillance technology. Pinned discreetly to the lapel of her beige trench coat was a small, elegant pearl brooch. Hidden expertly within the center of that faux pearl was a microscopic wide-angle camera lens, and a highly sensitive audio transmitter broadcasting directly to our encrypted servers. I stared at the glowing monitors, watching Bradley stroke my daughter hair with his violent hands. The sheer restraint required to not drive my truck through his living room wall and finish the job I started earlier was staggering, but I forced myself to watch. I needed the final nail in his coffin. Bradley led Camille to the surviving leather sofa, sitting her down and pouring her a glass of expensive bourbon. He poured a massive glass for himself, wincing sharply as the alcohol washed over his fractured jaw. The liquor was an act of sheer desperation. He was trying to numb the physical pain of my punch and the crushing psychological terror of his collapsing financial world. His corporate accounts were entirely frozen. The bank was demanding immediate answers regarding the fraudulent coastal villa collateral. The violent underground sports betting syndicate was undoubtedly blowing up his burner phone, demanding the money he had stolen from me. He was completely cornered, and he desperately needed a scapegoat. Bradley took a long, greedy gulp of his bourbon and set the heavy glass down on an end table. He looked at Camille with a predatory, calculating gaze. He told her that my unhinged actions had caused a massive misunderstanding with the federal banks. He claimed that because I was aggressively interfering with the company accounts, the federal authorities were now blindly investigating the $2 million wire transfer. He painted a terrifying fictional picture, telling Camille that the government was trying to frame them both for corporate fraud. But then his manipulative voice softened. He reached into his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document. He smoothed it out on the table, placing a pen right next to it. He told Camille that he had consulted with a top-tier defense attorney. He lied through his teeth, explaining that if she signed this sworn affidavit claiming she executed the $2 million transfer entirely on her own due to a misunderstanding of my directives, it would legally shield him from my wrath. He promised her that because she was my daughter, I would never allow the authorities to actually prosecute her. He told her it was the only possible way to save their marriage and protect their family wealth from my destructive paranoia. He was actively trying to force my daughter to sign a legally binding federal confession, taking the absolute full fall for his massive criminal theft. He wanted her to happily step into a prison cell so he could walk away scot-free. Camille stared at the document, playing her part flawlessly. She let her hands tremble. She asked him through fake tears if he was absolutely sure this would keep them safe. Bradley nodded enthusiastically, grimacing as his broken jaw shifted. He promised her the world, swearing that once the dust settled, they would take Leo and move to a beautiful private island far away from my toxic influence. Camille slowly picked up the pen. She let out a long, dramatic sigh and signed her name exactly where he pointed. Bradley snatched the document from the table with a speed that betrayed his intense desperation. He folded it and shoved it deep into his pocket, a look of profound relief washing over his bruised face. He genuinely believed he had just secured his ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. He believed he had successfully transferred all his federal liability onto his submissive, gullible wife. The adrenaline of his perceived victory, combined with the heavy alcohol surging through his bloodstream, made him incredibly reckless. He poured himself another massive glass of bourbon and leaned back against the sofa cushions. The protective filters of his polished corporate mask dissolved entirely. He began to laugh, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed through the hidden microphone directly into my earpiece. He looked at Camille and started to brag. He boasted about how incredibly easy it was to outsmart a primitive old dinosaur like me. He laughed about the coastal villa, mocking Corinne for being so terrified of losing her brother that she practically begged him to take the property. He detailed the exact angle he used to strike my wife, bragging about how the old woman crumpled to the kitchen floor without putting up a single fight. He gleefully confessed to purchasing the luxury sports car for his blonde mistress, using the exact funds Camille had wired him, entirely confirming his deep involvement in the money laundering scheme. He spared absolutely no detail. He laid out his entire criminal timeline, his violent extortion methods, and his absolute hatred for our family in crystal clear, undeniable audio. He painted a masterpiece of his own guilt. Sitting in the surveillance van, Vance reached forward and tapped a blinking green button on his console. The recording was immediately locked, encrypted, and transmitted straight into the secure federal servers of the Financial Crimes Division. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had crushed him entirely. Bradley walked out of his house that evening with a confident swagger that completely defied his bruised and battered face. Armed with the fraudulent confession Camille had just signed, he believed he was utterly invincible. He thought he had successfully severed the dead weight of his massive financial crimes and pinned them squarely on my daughter. Seeking the ultimate reward for his twisted genius, he drove his sports car straight to the luxurious downtown penthouse he had rented for his secret blonde mistress. He expected a warm, submissive reception to soothe his fractured ego. He expected to celebrate his perceived legal victory in absolute luxury, but he walked directly into a devastating ambush. I watched the entire sequence unfold via a hidden audio feed Vance had previously established in the mistress vehicle and through the encrypted security cameras in the penthouse lobby. The young woman was waiting for him not with open arms but with absolute venom burning in her eyes. She had spent the entire afternoon trying to max out the premium credit cards Bradley had given her, only to face a barrage of humiliating declines at every single high-end boutique in the city. When she aggressively confronted the banking representatives, they coldly informed her that the primary account holder was under a severe federal financial lockdown. She realized instantly that her wealthy corporate sugar daddy was completely broke. Bradley tried to deploy his usual polished charm, desperately attempting to calm her down by promising that a massive influx of untraceable cash was coming soon. He lied smoothly through his fractured jaw, claiming it was just a temporary banking glitch caused by a minor corporate audit. The young woman did not believe a single word of his pathetic excuses. She pulled out her smartphone and pressed play on a highly incriminating video right in his face. It was a hidden recording she had secretly taken weeks ago during one of their weekend getaways. It showed Bradley in a deeply compromised state, heavily intoxicated, snorting illegal narcotics off a glass table, and bragging explicitly about stealing millions from his elderly father-in-law. He proudly boasted about manipulating the company books, forging documents, and hiding assets in offshore accounts. She looked him dead in the eye and demanded $2 million in untraceable cash within 48 hours. If he failed to deliver the money, she promised to send the raw, unedited video directly to the corporate board of directors, the local news outlets, and the federal authorities. Bradley was entirely backed into an impossible corner. His beautiful escape plan had just mutated into a lethal parasite. He fled the expensive penthouse in a blind panic, his breathing ragged and his mind desperately scrambling for a way to survive the night. Desperation is a highly predictable catalyst. When a malignant narcissist runs out of options and faces absolute public ruin, they do not suddenly surrender and beg for forgiveness. They double down and commit catastrophic errors. Bradley was suffocating under the crushing weight of his dual extortion. The violent underground sports betting syndicate was actively hunting him for the $1.5 million he owed them for his degenerate gambling debts. Now his mistress was threatening to expose his heavy drug use and corporate theft for another $2 million. His bank accounts were frozen solid. His premium credit lines were completely eradicated. He needed millions of dollars in liquid cash immediately, and he had absolutely zero legal avenues left to acquire it. Driven by sheer blind panic, he made the single most reckless decision of his entire miserable life. He decided to target the physical core of my logistics empire. While the corporate bank accounts were locked down, the actual physical machinery of the business was still sitting in our massive commercial shipping yards. My company operated a highly lucrative fleet of 500 heavy-duty Peterbilt transport trucks. Each of these massive commercial rigs was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the open market. Bradley used an old set of master security override codes he had secretly copied months ago before I initiated the strict biometric lockdown. He bypassed the digital security gates of our secondary industrial lot located on the desolate industrial outskirts of the city. He violently broke into the site manager field office, shattering the glass window, and stole the physical paper titles to a dozen of our newest top-tier transport trucks. He intended to illegally liquidate the massive commercial vehicles on the black market. He frantically made calls from an untraceable burner phone, reaching out to a shady network of heavy machinery exporters he had previously met during his underground gambling trips. He offered them 12 pristine, heavy-duty logistics trucks at a fraction of their actual value, demanding a total cash payout by midnight. He honestly believed he could quietly sell off the foundational assets of my entire enterprise load, a heavy duffel bag with millions in cash, and disappear across the international border before anyone even noticed the trucks were missing from the yard. Sitting in the dimly lit command center of the secure safe house, Vance tapped his heavy fingers against the glowing digital console. He pulled up the live security feed from the secondary industrial lot and projected it onto the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. We watched in pristine high definition as Bradley frantically moved between the massive 18-wheelers, recording their vehicle identification numbers on a clipboard and desperately verifying the stolen paper titles. Thorne stood next to me, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The aggressive corporate attorney immediately pulled out his cell phone to dial the local police precinct. "We have him dead to rights," Thorne declared, his voice practically vibrating with intense legal excitement. "Breaking and entering grand theft auto and corporate sabotage. I can have 3 armed squad cars at that shipping yard in less than 5 minutes. They will catch him holding the stolen titles right next to the targeted vehicles. We can lock him in a concrete cell tonight and throw away the key forever." I reached out and firmly placed my large, heavy hand over Thorne's phone, pushing it slowly back down to the wooden desk. I did not break my icy gaze from the security monitor. "Stand down," I commanded, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. "Let him execute the sale." Thorne stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. "You want to let him drive off with $3 million worth of your commercial fleet?" he asked in sheer absolute disbelief. I turned to face my attorney, offering a cold, calculating smile. "A local grand theft auto charge is a manageable state-level felony, Thorne. A good high-priced lawyer could argue a familial dispute over company assets and drag the case out for years in a messy civil court. I am not interested in a mild civil dispute. Those trucks are officially registered commercial vehicles engaged in highly regulated interstate commerce. If Bradley actually attempts to illegally sell and transfer the titles of federal logistics assets to an unauthorized black market buyer, he elevates his crime from a local theft to massive federal trafficking of commercial goods. He triggers the direct jurisdiction of the FBI Transport Division. I want him to cross the absolute point of no return. I want him to commit a federal crime so severe that no amount of slick corporate charm or white privilege will ever save him." We sit here in silence and we let him dig his own grave. We watched the glowing monitors in total silence as the digital clock in the corner of the screen officially struck midnight. 2 heavy black cargo vans slowly rolled through the compromised security gates of the industrial lot, their headlights cutting through the freezing fog. Bradley stood under the flickering amber light of a solitary street lamp, clutching the stolen paper titles to his chest. He looked eager and deeply relieved, expecting a heavy canvas duffel bag filled with millions of dollars in untraceable cash. The side doors of the cargo vans violently slid open. A dozen heavily armed men stepped out into the freezing night air. They were not black market vehicle exporters. Bradley realized his fatal, absolute mistake the exact second the lead figure stepped into the light. It was the brutal enforcer from the underground sports betting syndicate. They had successfully intercepted the black market chatter about the stolen commercial trucks and decided to collect their massive debt directly from the source. The towering enforcer snatched the paperwork from Bradley, trembling hands inspected the corporate titles and laughed a harsh, cruel sound that echoed across the empty lot. He knew these trucks were high-profile stolen federal assets that were completely radioactive and impossible to fence safely. Bradley had desperately tried to pay his blood debt with stolen, unsellable heat. Bradley turned to run, but a heavy wooden baseball bat slammed violently into the back of his knees with a sickening crack. He collapsed to the freezing concrete, screaming in absolute, unadulterated agony. The armed men descended upon him, kicking him brutally in the ribs and face before dragging his bloodied, limp body into the back of the dark cargo van. They slammed the heavy metal doors shut and sped off into the darkness, leaving the shipping yard completely empty. Bradley was officially a hostage to monsters far worse than any federal judge. The digital monitors in the secure safe house flickered, casting a pale blue glow across the heavy oak desk. I watched the taillights of the syndicate cargo vans disappear into the freezing fog, taking my treacherous son-in-law with them. Thorne paced the length of the room, nervously adjusting his silk tie. He was a corporate shark, but this level of raw street violence was entirely outside his comfortable jurisdiction. He opened his mouth to suggest calling the authorities to report a kidnapping, but a sharp ringing pierced the silence of the command center. It was my private encrypted cell phone. The caller identification displayed Bradley's personal number. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the heavy tension to fill the room before pressing the speaker button and placing the device flat on the desk. A deep, gravelly voice echoed through the high-fidelity speaker. It was not Bradley. It was the brutal syndicate enforcer who had just shattered his kneecaps with a baseball bat. The man did not bother with introductions or pleasantries. He stated plainly that he had my son-in-law chained to a concrete pillar in an undisclosed warehouse. He outlined Bradley massive gambling debts detailing the $1.5 million currently owed and the additional penalties accrued for attempting to pay them off with highly radioactive stolen commercial truck titles. The enforcer made it absolutely clear that Bradley life was currently hanging by a very thin thread. The demand was straightforward and entirely non-negotiable. $5 million in untraceable cryptocurrency transferred to an offshore wallet within the next 24 hours. If I failed to meet the deadline, or if I attempted to involve federal law enforcement, they promised to send Bradley back to my corporate headquarters piece by piece inside cardboard shipping boxes. I listened to the violent threats without a single flinch. In the background of the audio feed, I could hear the muffled, agonizing groans of Bradley crying out in extreme physical pain. He was desperately begging me to pay the ransom, sobbing about how he was family and how Camille would never forgive me if I let him die. His pathetic pleas disgusted me. He had beaten my wife, stolen my money, and attempted to rob my daughter of her future. Now he expected my wealth to serve as his ultimate shield against the monsters he had actively invited into his own life. I did not answer the enforcer immediately. I reached into the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a heavy, rusted steel wrench. It was the very first tool I ever owned from the days when I slept in the freezing cab of my single delivery truck. It was a tangible reminder of the blood and grease that built my empire long before men in tailored suits tried to claim it. I pulled a clean microfiber cloth from my pocket and began slowly polishing the cold metal. The rhythmic scraping sound echoed softly into the phone speaker. The enforcer demanded an immediate answer, growing impatient with my absolute silence. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. "You listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper. "That pathetic excuse for a man breathing heavily in your background is not my family. He is a parasite who laid his violent hands on my wife. He assaulted the woman who stood by me when I had nothing but this wrench and a mountain of debt. I do not pay ransoms for domestic abusers. I do not negotiate with street-level thugs who think they can extort a titan." The enforcer went completely silent, likely shocked by the sheer absolute coldness of my response. He expected a panicked, wealthy grandfather desperate to save his legacy. He got a ruthless kingpin instead. "I want you to understand exactly what you are holding," I continued, running the cloth deliberately down the heavy steel handle. "You have a man with zero assets, completely frozen bank accounts, and a pending federal indictment for grand theft and corporate fraud hanging over his head. He is entirely worthless to me. So I am going to make this extremely simple for you. I will not pay you $5 million. I will not pay you a single dime. You can keep him. Do whatever you want with him." I dropped the heavy steel wrench loudly onto the wooden desk and ended the call, instantly cutting off Bradley, terrified, screaming. The violent syndicate enforcers were entirely ruthless businessmen. They recognized immediately that my absolute refusal was not a negotiation tactic. It was a permanent death sentence for their hostage. Bradley had lost his only remaining financial safety net. Stripped of his leverage and abandoned by the wealthy family he had systematically tried to destroy, he faced the pure, unadulterated wrath of the criminal underworld. Vance utilized his extensive federal network to tap into the local surveillance grids, tracking the syndicate movements throughout the night. The cargo vans did not stay at the warehouse. They drove to an illegal waste disposal site on the desolate industrial edge of the city. The security cameras captured the grim sequence of events. The armed men dragged Bradley's battered body out of the dark van and threw him violently onto the frozen ground. They did not kill him instantly. Death was far too easy a release for a man who owed them over $1 million. They proceeded to beat him with a calculated mechanical precision designed to inflict maximum physical agony without stopping his heart. They shattered his ribs, fractured his collarbone, and completely destroyed his pristine corporate face. When they were finally finished, they kicked his broken, limp body down a steep embankment into a massive pile of rotting garbage and industrial waste. The lead enforcer stood at the top of the ridge, looking down at the bloody mess. He delivered a final, chilling ultimatum that Vance audio surveillance microphones picked up perfectly. 24 hours, the enforcer growled into the freezing darkness. "You have exactly 24 hours to bring us our money. Steal it. Beg for it. We do not care. If you do not have the cash by midnight tomorrow, we will not just kill you, we will find that blonde mistress of yours and make her pay your debt." The van sped away, leaving Bradley completely alone, bleeding heavily into the toxic dirt of the landfill. Hours later, as the freezing morning sun began to rise, Bradley finally regained consciousness. He dragged his broken, bleeding body out of the industrial garbage dump, driven entirely by the pure primal instinct to survive. He had no friends, no allies, and absolutely no corporate credit left. But he still possessed a highly dangerous level of cornered desperation. He limped to a seedy pawn shop in the worst district of the city, trading his expensive customized gold watch, the only asset the syndicate had failed to strip from his wrist, for a cheap unregistered black market revolver. He loaded the cylinder with shaking, blood-stained hands. He knew my corporate accounts were impenetrable. He knew the federal banks were completely locked down. But he also knew I kept a highly secure physical emergency safe hidden inside my primary residential estate. He wrongly assumed the house would be completely empty. He assumed I was still hiding Camille and Corinne at the safe house. He decided to break into my home holding a loaded weapon to steal whatever cash and jewelry remained. It was his absolute, final, desperate heist. The freezing night air whipped through the massive oak trees surrounding my private estate, howling like a chorus of angry ghosts. Bradley limped heavily up the long, winding driveway, dragging his shattered leg behind him. He was a truly gruesome sight to behold. His expensive designer clothes, once a symbol of his perceived superiority, were now torn to absolute shreds and completely soaked in a foul mixture of his own blood and the toxic sludge from the industrial landfill. He gripped a cheap black market revolver in his trembling hand, entirely driven by the blind, reckless panic of a cornered animal. He expected to find a heavily guarded fortress protected by layers of elite private security. Instead, he found my massive property completely submerged in total darkness. I had specifically dismissed my entire armed security detail for the night, sending them home with strict orders not to return until morning. I had deliberately disabled the exterior perimeter alarms and completely deactivated the motion sensors. I wanted the heavy front door wide open for him, but Bradley was too consumed by his own desperate criminal fantasy to even check the handle. He dragged his broken body to the back patio and used the heavy steel butt of his revolver to violently smash the reinforced glass of my French doors. The sharp, deafening sound of shattering glass echoed loudly through the silent property, slicing through the quiet night. He stepped inside, his ruined, expensive boots crunching heavily over the jagged, broken shards. He moved through the pitch-black hallways of my home, breathing in ragged, painful gasps that echoed off the high ceilings. He navigated the opulent corridors strictly by memory, making his way directly toward the master study where he knew I kept my physical emergencies safe. He was completely convinced that I was miles away, hiding in fear with Corinne and Camille at the secure safe house. He thought he was executing the ultimate stealth heist. He truly believed he could blow the floor safe, grab millions of dollars in untraceable emergency cash, and vanish across the border into the night before the sun ever came up. He pushed open the heavy mahogany door to my study, leaning his battered shoulder against the wooden door frame to support his broken weight. He raised his weapon, stepping into the pitch-black room, his greedy eyes searching the dark for the hidden vault. He did not realize he had just walked directly into the center of my web. I reached out and flicked the switch on the brass reading lamp resting on my desk. The sudden burst of warm yellow light instantly flooded the room, completely illuminating the space. I was sitting perfectly still in my heavy leather armchair, positioned directly in the center of the study. I did not hold a weapon. I did not flinch when the light hit his grotesque, ruined face. I simply sat there with my hands resting calmly on the armrests, watching the absolute terror wash over his bloodied features. Bradley froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden, horrifying realization that he was not alone. The psychological confrontation began before a single word was ever spoken. He looked at my pristine, tailored suit, my calm, unyielding demeanor, and my absolute control of the environment. Then he looked down at his own violently trembling hands and his garbage-soaked clothes. The stark, undeniable contrast completely shattered whatever remained of his fragile, artificial ego. His pure terror rapidly mutated into a vile, unchecked rage. The polished corporate facade he had worn for years melted away, exposing the absolute core of his true nature. "You think you are so incredibly smart," he spat, thick blood and saliva flying from his fractured jaw onto my expensive rug. "You think because you have a few $1,000,000 you are my equal. You are nothing but an uneducated street thug who got lucky hauling dirt." His voice escalated into a manic, hysterical scream. He paced the floor, dragging his broken leg, unleashing a torrent of absolute racial venom. He told me that my immense wealth was a massive statistical error in the universe. He screamed that men like him with his flawless pedigree, his skin color, and his elite education were born to rule empires like mine. He claimed I was an arrogant imposter sitting on a throne built specifically for a superior class of men. He justified his massive financial theft, his extreme violence against my wife, and his ultimate betrayal as his natural given birthright. He genuinely believed that stripping a successful black man of his life work was not a federal crime, but a required restoration of the natural societal order. I sat there and absorbed his vile, pathetic rant without moving a single muscle in my body. "You are nothing but a bleeding rat standing on my rug," I replied, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper. My absolute lack of fear pushed his fragile psychological state entirely over the edge of sanity. The cold, hard truth of my words pierced right through his deeply ingrained racist delusions of grandeur. He realized in that exact chilling moment that his elite university education, his societal privilege, and his arrogant superiority complex had absolutely no power in this room. He was completely bankrupt, relentlessly hunted by violent loan sharks, entirely abandoned by his young mistress, and facing decades in a harsh federal penitentiary. I had systematically stripped him of every single advantage he ever possessed, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the cheap stolen gun in his trembling hand. The psychological dismantling of my son-in-law was finally complete. Bradley let out a guttural, animalistic roar that tore through his damaged throat. He raised the black market revolver, aiming the cold, dark steel barrel directly at the exact center of my forehead. His hands were shaking violently, his finger hovering dangerously over the trigger mechanism. "This ends right now," he screamed, his bloodshot eyes wide with sheer homicidal desperation and pure madness. "I am taking the emergency cash right now. I am taking the entire logistics empire for myself, and I am putting you in the cold ground exactly where your kind belongs." He stood less than 10 feet away from my desk. At that incredibly close range, even a desperate man with trembling hands and a broken leg could not possibly miss a fatal headshot. The metallic cylinder of the heavy revolver rotated slightly as he applied heavy pressure to the trigger. He was entirely committed to committing a cold-blooded murder simply to save his own pathetic life. I did not raise my hands in sudden surrender. I did not beg for my life or attempt to dive behind the heavy mahogany desk for cover. I stared directly down the dark barrel of his weapon, maintaining the absolute unyielding calm of a titan who controls every single variable on the violent battlefield. "Go ahead, Bradley," I commanded, my voice echoing with pure lethal absolute authority. "Pull the trigger and claim your crown." Bradley roared, clenching his fractured jaw in absolute agony as he pulled the heavy metal trigger with all his remaining physical strength, entirely expecting the deafening explosion of a gunshot to instantly end my life. Click. A hollow metallic snap echoed loudly through the silent study. There was no blinding fire. There was no deafening explosion. Bradley froze his entire body, going completely rigid with sudden absolute confusion. He frantically pulled the heavy trigger a second time. Click. He pulled it again and again in a blind, sweating panic. Click, click, click. The cheap revolver was completely useless. I let out a low, dark chuckle that chilled the entire room. "You really thought Camille was just a naive, submissive wife?" I asked, watching his eyes widen in pure, absolute horror. "She knew you kept an emergency stash of specialized ammunition hidden in your home office. Before she left you, she meticulously emptied the active gunpowder from every single round in your safe. You are firing blanks, Bradley. My daughter disarmed you long before you ever stepped foot on my property." I slowly stood up from the leather armchair. My massive, imposing silhouette rose against the dim light, casting a towering absolute shadow over his broken, cowering form. I stepped out from behind the heavy mahogany desk, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator circling its trapped prey. Bradley stumbled backward, his shattered leg buckling under his weight. The useless black market revolver slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He raised his bloodied hands over his face, instinctively bracing himself for a brutal physical execution. He expected me to deliver a savage beating that would finish the job the underground syndicate had started. He expected me to beat him to death right there on my expensive rug for pointing a loaded weapon at my head. But I did not raise my fists. I did not even break a sweat. Striking a man who was already completely broken was entirely beneath me. I looked down at his cowering, pathetic form with absolute, unadulterated disgust. He was not a rival kingpin worthy of physical combat. He was merely a pest that needed to be legally and systematically exterminated from my family tree. I reached over to the edge of my desk and picked up a thick, heavy manila folder that Thorne had prepared for me earlier that afternoon. I tossed it effortlessly across the room. It landed with a loud, authoritative thud directly at Bradley's ruined boots. The heavy impact startled him, causing him to flinch violently like a beaten dog. "Pick it up!" I commanded, my voice echoing through the study with freezing, absolute authority. Bradley stared at the folder, his breath hitching in his chest. He slowly lowered his hands, realizing I was not going to strike him. He dropped to his knees, groaning in intense physical agony as his fractured collarbone shifted and reached out with a trembling, blood-stained hand to open the file. He flipped open the heavy cover, revealing a thick stack of meticulously drafted legal documents. These were not transition papers or corporate mergers. They were absolute, unconditional surrender documents. "Read them carefully, Bradley," I said, standing directly over him, casting a massive, unyielding shadow. "The first document is a fully executed divorce decree. It grants my daughter Camille immediate and absolute dissolution of your marriage, giving her 100% of all shared marital assets and completely nullifying any claim you have to our family wealth. The second document is a voluntary and permanent termination of all your parental rights regarding my grandson Leo. You will never see him, speak to him, or legally acknowledge him ever again. The third document is a comprehensive sworn confession. It details exactly how you violently assaulted my wife Corinne, how you systematically manipulated my daughter, and how you actively committed massive wire fraud against my logistics company." Bradley stared at the documents, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. He looked up at me, his face a mask of pure desperation. "Why would I ever sign this?" he choked out, coughing up a thin string of dark blood. "If I sign this, I lose absolutely everything I have spent years building. I have nothing left to live for." "You have exactly one thing left to live for." "Bradley," I replied, my tone dead and completely devoid of mercy. "Your actual life. You owe a highly violent underground sports betting syndicate $1.5 million. They demanded $5 million by midnight tomorrow to spare your life. If you sign every single page in that folder right now, I will immediately authorize a $5 million cryptocurrency transfer to their offshore wallet. I will pay your blood debt and buy your miserable existence. If you refuse, I will physically drag you out my front door and throw you directly onto the street where their enforcers are undoubtedly already waiting to finish the job they started at the landfill. The choice is yours. Sign the papers and live or die screaming in a dark alley tonight." The absolute reality of his grim situation crushed whatever tiny fragment of defiance he had left. Bradley was a malignant narcissist and a violent predator, but above all else, he was a pathetic coward who desperately feared his own mortality. He thought about the heavy wooden baseball bat shattering his kneecaps. He thought about the cold, toxic mud of the industrial landfill. He knew with absolute certainty that the syndicate would not hesitate to torture him to death if he failed to deliver the money. He looked at the thick stack of legal documents and then up at my cold, unyielding face. He realized I was offering him the only viable exit strategy he would ever get. His survival instinct completely overrode his massive ego. He let out a pathetic, broken sob, completely surrendering to my absolute authority. He scrambled to grab the heavy gold pen clipped to the inside of the folder, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it straight. He did not bother reading the fine print. He aggressively flipped through the dense pages, hastily scribbling his signature on every single dotted line. He stained the pristine white paper with his own dark blood, leaving crimson fingerprints across the official legal decrees. He was rapidly signing away his marriage, his only child, and his entire public reputation. He was legally confessing to brutal domestic violence and massive corporate fraud. But in his twisted, desperate mind, he honestly believed he was securing a major victory. He believed he was trading worthless paper for $5 million in literal blood money. He thought he could sign the documents, survive the night, and disappear into the shadows to eventually rebuild his fraudulent life elsewhere. He finished the final signature and pushed the heavy folder across the floor toward my expensive leather shoes. "I signed it all," he gasped, dropping the gold pen and clutching his shattered ribs. "I gave you everything you wanted. Now transfer the money to the syndicate. Save my life, Hollis. You gave me your word." I slowly bent down and retrieved the blood-stained folder from the floor. I meticulously checked every single signature, verifying that his unconditional legal surrender was absolutely complete. The dark ink was barely dry on the heavy paper when a sudden deafening noise shattered the quiet night. A massive chorus of high-pitched tactical sirens erupted simultaneously from every direction, completely surrounding my private estate. Intense flashing red and blue strobe lights violently pierced through the darkness, illuminating the shattered French doors and projecting chaotic shadows across the study walls. The heavy sound of armored vehicles screeching to a halt on my paved driveway echoed loudly through the large house. Bradley froze, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute uncomprehending panic. He looked at the flashing lights and then turned his terrified gaze back to me. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You promised to save me from the syndicate." I looked down at him, offering a chilling, freezing smile that held absolutely zero mercy. "I did promise to pay your debt and save you from the underground syndicate, Bradley," I said, my voice slicing through the deafening wail of the approaching sirens. "But I never said a single word about saving you from the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The heavy oak double doors of my estate did not just swing open. They were violently breached. A tactical battering ram shattered the reinforced locking mechanism, sending splinters of expensive wood flying across the grand foyer. A highly coordinated tactical unit of federal agents flooded into the house. They wore heavy dark Kevlar vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. Flashlights mounted on automatic rifles sliced through the darkness, cutting out the shadows in my study. They moved with absolute military precision, securing the perimeter and converging directly on the master study where I stood. Bradley had not even registered the full weight of my last sentence before the armed agents swarmed him. He tried to scramble backward away from the blinding tactical lights, but his shattered leg gave out completely. Two massive federal agents grabbed him by the shoulders of his ruined designer jacket and violently slammed him face first into the hardwood floor. The impact echoed sharply through the room. They did not show an ounce of hesitation or gentle treatment. A heavy tactical boot planted firmly right between his shoulder blades, pinning him down like a feral animal caught in a trap. He gasped for air, his face pressed painfully against the floorboards right next to the blood-stained legal documents he had just signed. The sharp, cold sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his bruised wrists rang out with absolute finality. I stood perfectly still behind my mahogany desk, calmly watching the entire physical takedown unfold. I did not flinch or offer any assistance. The man who had terrorized my family, who had brutally beaten my wife on her own kitchen floor, was now eating dust underneath the boots of the federal government. He thrashed wildly against the heavy constraints, screaming in a high-pitched, panicked voice, demanding to know what was happening. He still clung to the pathetic delusion that this was all just a massive misunderstanding. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern face, grabbed Bradley by the collar and hauled him roughly to his knees. The physical submission was absolute. Bradley was no longer the arrogant corporate executive looking down his nose at an old black truck driver. He was a broken, bleeding criminal entirely at the mercy of the system he thought he could manipulate. The lead agent did not offer polite explanations. He pulled a thick folded warrant from his tactical vest and began reading with a voice devoid of any human empathy. "You are under arrest by the authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the agent declared loudly, projecting his voice over Bradley, pathetic sobbing. The list of federal indictments dropped on his head like heavy concrete blocks. First-degree wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, interstate trafficking of stolen commercial assets, massive corporate embezzlement, federal tax evasion linked to the fraudulent transfer of coastal real estate, extreme money laundering to fund underground criminal syndicates, forgery of legal business documents, and the final charge, courtesy of the recorded confession he had just happily provided to my daughter, aggravated domestic assault resulting in severe bodily harm. 8 devastating federal felony charges. Each individual count carried a minimum mandatory sentence that would guarantee he spent the rest of his natural life staring at gray concrete walls. As the federal agent listed the extensive catalog of his crimes, the last remaining fragments of Bradley's polished corporate facade violently shattered. He was officially stripped of his sophisticated executive armor. His elite university pedigree, his affluent societal connections, and his deep-seated racial superiority complex meant absolutely nothing in the face of a massive, airtight federal indictment. He was hyperventilating, coughing up blood, and gasping for air as the sheer magnitude of his permanent ruin finally set in. The illusion of his supremacy dissolved into the cold reality of a federal holding cell. Every single lie he had told, every single document he had forged, and every drop of blood he had spilled had been perfectly packaged into a lethal legal weapon. He was no longer the mastermind. He was just another common criminal caught in a federal dragnet. Despite being physically bound and bleeding profusely from his shattered jaw, a toxic surge of desperate arrogance flared up inside him. He refused to accept his total defeat. He firmly believed that the American justice system was inherently designed to protect wealthy white men like him, regardless of their massive crimes. He violently twisted his shoulders, trying to shake off the grip of the federal agents holding him down. "I know my rights," he screamed, his voice cracking under the intense strain of his panic. "You cannot do this to me. I am a highly respected financial director. This is a targeted setup. My father-in-law orchestrated this entire illegal scheme to frame me. I demand my phone. I want my personal attorney right now." He craned his neck to glare at me with absolute murderous hatred. "You think you can lock me away, Hollis?" he spat, showing his bloodied teeth. "I have the best legal representation in the entire state. My attorney will shred these pathetic charges before the sun even comes up. I will post whatever bail the judge sets, and I will walk right out of the federal courthouse tomorrow morning. You will pay for this. I will sue you for everything you own and take the company anyway." He was grasping at invisible straws, heavily relying on the traditional power of top-tier legal defense to magically erase his mountain of federal crimes. He genuinely thought that expensive lawyers and a tailored suit would automatically shield him from the consequences of his actions, just as they always had in his privileged past. He was demanding the presence of Kensington, the most notorious cutthroat defense attorney in the city. Kensington was a high-priced legal mercenary famous for getting guilty executives completely off the hook through aggressive technicalities and massive financial settlements. Bradley truly believed that if he could just get Kensington in the room, he could easily buy his way out of a federal prison cell. Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed down the hallway. A figure stepped through the shattered doorway and walked calmly into the bright light of the master study. It was Kensington himself, carrying a pristine leather briefcase and wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit. Bradley's eyes lit up with immediate, triumphant relief. "Kensington," he gasped, practically weeping with joy. "Tell these federal agents to take these cuffs off me right now. Start filing the injunctions." Kensington did not rush to his client's side. He did not demand the federal agents stand down. He stood perfectly straight, looked down at the broken man kneeling on the floor, and offered a chillingly cold stare. "I am not filing anything for you, Bradley," the high-powered attorney stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "I am no longer your legal representation. I am legally barred from taking your case due to a strict conflict of interest." Bradley's face dropped in pure, uncomprehending horror. "Why?" he stammered. Kensington turned his head, gave me a respectful nod, and looked back at the criminal on the floor. "Because Mr. Hollis executed a massive corporate buyout at 6 o'clock this morning," Kensington replied smoothly. "He just purchased the majority controlling shares of my entire law firm. You are completely on your own." 6 months dragged by with agonizing slowness, while Bradley sat locked inside a maximum security federal holding facility. His massive bail requests were continuously denied by the presiding judge thanks to the overwhelming flight risk and the sheer severity of his multi-million-dollar financial crimes. When the morning of the trial finally arrived, the federal courthouse felt like a sterile concrete coliseum preparing for a brutal public execution. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the gallery, dressed in a pristine charcoal-tailored suit, holding Corinne tightly by the hand. She was fully healed, her posture perfectly straight, and her dignity completely restored to its rightful place. Camille sat on my other side, her expression a flawless mask of absolute stone staring directly ahead. Bradley was escorted into the bright courtroom by 2 heavily armed federal marshals. The physical transformation of my former son-in-law was absolutely staggering. Stripped of his high-end barbers, his custom Italian suits, and his bottomless corporate expense accounts, he looked incredibly small and exceptionally frail. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit provided by his overworked public defender. His jaw had fully healed from my single punch, but it set at a slightly crooked, unnatural angle, serving as a permanent physical reminder of the night he violently placed his hands on my family. Because I had aggressively purchased Kensington lucrative law firm Bradley, was forced to rely entirely on a court-appointed public defender who looked completely exhausted before the trial even officially began. The entire defense strategy was agonizingly predictable and deeply insulting. The public defender stood before the silent jury and desperately attempted to paint a tragic, completely fabricated picture of a broken man. He shamelessly argued that Bradley was a victim of severe clinical depression and insurmountable family pressure. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, casting me as a tyrannical, overbearing father-in-law who relentlessly bullied and micromanaged his highly educated son-in-law. The defense claimed that my oppressive old-school nature drove Bradley to an absolute mental breakdown, causing him to make irrational, desperate financial decisions as a loud cry for psychological help. He even tried to spin the brutal domestic assault on Corinne as a tragic physical accident born from a severe panic attack. He desperately wanted the jury to look at this privileged man and see a tragic victim of circumstance crushed by the massive weight of my ruthless corporate expectations. It was a sickening display of manipulative theater designed entirely to exploit the natural sympathies of the jury. Bradley sat at the defense table, keeping his head lowered, attempting to project an aura of profound remorse and brokenness. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut, trying to force a fake tear to fall onto the wooden table. The lead federal prosecutor did not object to the dramatic defense narrative. He simply sat in his chair and let the public defender finish his pathetic theatrical performance before slowly standing up from his table. The prosecutor was a highly seasoned legal veteran who knew that absolute, undeniable facts always destroy emotional manipulation. He did not deliver a passionate opening statement or try to counter the fake psychological theories with his own psychological experts. He simply addressed the federal judge and introduced Exhibit A into the official court record. The bright lights in the massive courtroom dimmed slightly. Two large high-definition flat-screen monitors mounted on the oak walls flickered to life. The crystal-clear video footage captured by the microscopic camera hidden inside Camille Pearl Brooch began to play for the entire room. The jury was instantly transported back to Bradley's ruined living room. They watched in absolute stunned silence as Bradley sat on his leather sofa, pouring a massive glass of expensive bourbon over his ice. The audio was pristine, broadcasting his arrogant voice directly into the quiet hall. The jury watched him gleefully and aggressively coerce his crying wife into signing a fraudulent federal confession, specifically designed to send her to federal prison in his place. Then the true, unadulterated horror began. The jury listened closely as the heavy alcohol loosened his tongue and his polished victim mask completely dissolved into nothingness. They heard him explicitly brag about the exact angle he used to physically strike Corinne, viciously mocking her frailty as she crumpled to my kitchen floor in agonizing pain. They heard him lay out the intricate details of his massive corporate embezzlement and money laundering scheme, laughing hysterically about how incredibly easy it was to outsmart the federal banking system. And finally, they heard the pure, unfiltered racial venom. Bradley's arrogant voice echoed through the massive courtroom, claiming his inherent societal superiority, mocking my background, and stating that educated men like him were simply meant to steal empires from uneducated men like me. Every single vile, discriminatory, and violent thought he held in his dark heart was broadcast loudly for the judge, the jury, and the general public to hear. The atmosphere inside the federal courtroom shifted instantly with a heavy, undeniable gravity. The air grew incredibly thick with absolute visceral disgust. I watched the 12 men and women sitting silently in the jury box. They were ordinary, hardworking citizens, business owners, teachers, and parents who understood the value of absolute truth. The initial fleeting sympathy the public defender had desperately tried to cultivate vanished into thin air. The jurors' faces hardened into rigid masks of pure, unfiltered outrage. Several of them physically recoiled in their leather seats, visibly sickened by the casual, brutal arrogance radiating from the high-definition screens. They were not looking at a depressed man crushed by unfair family expectations or mental health struggles. They were looking directly at a violent, predatory monster who felt absolutely zero remorse for systematically destroying the people who loved him the most. The public defender physically shrank down into his chair, resting his pale face heavily in his hands. He knew instantly that his entire depression defense had just been violently incinerated by his own client-recorded bragging. There was no possible legal maneuver, no clever cross-examination to explain away a high-definition video of a man proudly confessing to brutal elder abuse and massive federal wire fraud. Bradley sat completely frozen at the defense table, all the remaining color rapidly draining from his crooked face. The pathetic illusion of the broken victim was entirely shattered beyond any repair. He slowly turned his head away from the bright monitors and looked directly at the gallery. His panicked, bloodshot eyes locked instantly onto Camille. He stared at the lapel of her designer trench coat, finally realizing exactly how the federal government had acquired that damning intimate footage. The woman he thought he had completely subjugated, the loyal wife he tried to maliciously frame for federal crimes, was the exact person who wore the hidden wire that destroyed his life forever. Camille did not look away or flinch. She stared back at him with an icy, unblinking gaze that mirrored my own ruthless intensity. The defense formally rested their entire case without calling a single character witness or attempting a futile cross-examination. There was absolutely nothing left to say. The digital evidence was a lethal, airtight coffin. The federal judge delivered the final solemn instructions to the jury, outlining the strict legal parameters for the 8 devastating felony counts. In complicated cases involving complex financial fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and severe domestic violence, jury deliberations routinely take several agonizing days to meticulously review the dense mountain of evidence. The armed bailiff escorted the 12 jurors out of the courtroom, and the heavy oak doors closed securely behind them. I remained seated in the front row, holding Corinne's hand, refusing to leave the hall for a single second. I did not have to wait long. Less than 45 minutes later, a sharp, loud buzzer echoed forcefully through the silent courtroom, signaling that the jury had already reached a unanimous decision. The terrifying speed of their rapid return was absolutely unheard of in a federal court. It was not a careful deliberation. It was a swift, merciless execution of justice. The jurors filed back into their designated seats, refusing to even cast a single glance in Bradley's direction. The judge adjusted his glasses and asked the foreperson if they had officially reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a stern, unyielding face, stood up straight. She looked directly at the judge and spoke in a loud, clear voice that rang with absolute, undeniable finality. "Guilty on all charges." The word guilty hung in the sterile courtroom air like the sharp blade of a guillotine finally dropping. The silence was absolute. Bradley swayed heavily on his feet, his crooked jaw trembling as the reality of the sweeping conviction crashed into his fragile mind. The federal judge did not wait for the dust to settle or offer a scheduled recess for sentencing. The magistrate adjusted his heavy black robe and looked down from his elevated bench with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He adjusted his microphone and addressed the courtroom. "Bradley," he began, his voice echoing off the high acoustic walls, "you are a man who possessed every single societal advantage imaginable. You were given elite education, wealth, and a family who welcomed you with open arms. Instead of honoring that immense privilege, you chose to operate with a level of malignant greed and calculated cruelty that deeply offends this court. You violently assaulted an elderly woman in her own home. You systematically attempted to gaslight your wife and steal a logistics empire built by a man whose shoes you are not fit to shine." The judge paused, letting his sharp condemnation sink deep into the silent room. "There will be absolutely zero leniency for a predator of your caliber. For the 8 federal felony counts, including aggravated wire fraud, severe elder abuse, and massive corporate embezzlement, I sentence you to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary." The judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a deafening crack that sealed my former son-in-law fate forever. "This is a mandatory federal sentence. There will be no possibility of parole. There will be no early release for good behavior. You will serve every single day of those 2.5 decades behind solid steel bars." Bradley's legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, gasping for air as if the oxygen had just been violently sucked out of the large room. 25 years. By the time he walked out of those concrete prison walls, he would be a broken, obsolete old man with absolutely nothing to his name. The heavy wooden gavel struck a second time, officially adjourning the landmark trial. The courtroom immediately erupted into a chaotic symphony of murmurs, shifting chairs, and reporters frantically typing on their digital devices. The 2 heavily armed federal marshals stepped forward, instantly grabbing Bradley by the arms to haul him up from his chair. They clamped thick steel transport chains around his wrists and ankles, preparing to drag him back down into the subterranean holding cells to await his permanent transfer to a federal supermax facility. I did not celebrate. I did not cheer or embrace my wife. I slowly stood up from my seat in the front row, carefully buttoning my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I turned to Corinne and Camille, offering them a brief, reassuring nod before stepping out into the center aisle. I walked with slow, deliberate purpose toward the low, wooden barricade that separated the public gallery from the defense tables. The federal marshals noticed my imposing approach. Out of profound respect for what my family had endured, they briefly paused their forceful extraction, holding Bradley securely by his chained arms right at the wooden partition. Bradley slowly lifted his heavy, battered head to look at me. His face was stained with fresh tears and a thick layer of cold, terrified sweat. His eyes were wide, empty voids, pleading for a final shred of human mercy, or perhaps hoping I would offer a grand, forgiving speech to soothe his shattered conscience. He wanted closure. He wanted to believe that despite his permanent incarceration, he had at least salvaged a tiny fragment of his psychological dignity. He was completely wrong. I did not approach the barricade to offer forgiveness or moral closure. I stepped right up to the wooden divider, leaning my tall frame slightly forward until my face was merely inches away from his trembling ear. The chaotic noise of the busy courtroom faded entirely into the background, leaving only the freezing space between the victor and the absolute vanquished. I kept my voice incredibly low, projecting a freezing, lethal whisper that was intended exclusively for him. "You thought you were a brilliant financial mastermind, Bradley," I murmured, watching his bloodshot eyes dart nervously toward my face. "You thought you outsmarted an old truck driver when you stole that coastal villa and used it to secure your massive commercial loan. What your expensive degree failed to teach you is that a true kingpin never surrenders a piece of land without a destructive contingency plan. I used my absolute authority as the chairman of the Regional Logistics Council to legally petition the Municipal Zoning Board 3 weeks ago. I successfully rezoned the pristine beachfront property directly surrounding your newly acquired villa into a highly active industrial waste processing facility." I watched the color drain completely from his already pale face. "The property value plunged to absolute zero overnight. The commercial bank is going to permanently foreclose on a toxic, worthless asset and hold you entirely liable for the massive remaining deficit." But I did not stop there, Bradley. You remember the $5 million blood debt you owed to that violent underground sports betting syndicate? I reached out to their leadership network a few days after they shattered your kneecaps in that landfill. I legally purchased your entire outstanding debt at a premium discount. I am now your sole exclusive creditor. You owe me $5 million. In that maximum security federal penitentiary, you will be assigned hard manual labor. You will be stamping metal license plates, scrubbing concrete toilets, and doing heavy laundry for exactly 25 cents an hour. And because I now own your legally recognized debt, every single shiny quarter you earn for the next 2.5 decades will be automatically garnished by the federal penal system and deposited directly into my corporate accounts. You are going to work for me every single day until your bones completely rot inside that concrete cage. The absolute crushing magnitude of my final masterstroke shattered his fragile mind into a million irreparable pieces. The realization that he was not just going to prison but was completely financially and psychologically owned by the very man he despised triggered a massive total system failure. Bradley let out a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that silenced the entire bustling courtroom. He thrashed violently against his heavy steel transport chains, crying hysterically and spitting saliva as a pure primal madness completely consumed him. He kicked and writhed like a wild feral beast caught in a steel trap, entirely abandoning any remaining shred of his polished human dignity. The federal marshals immediately lost their patience. They aggressively tackled him, dragging him backward by his armpits as he continued to wail and sob uncontrollably. His expensive leather shoes dragged uselessly across the polished hardwood floor. I stood perfectly still at the wooden barricade, with my hands clasped firmly behind my back, watching with cold satisfaction as they hauled him through the heavy oak doors. He was dragged away screaming into the darkness, discarded from my world exactly like a worthless piece of rotting garbage. The transition from the pristine corporate world to the brutal reality of a federal supermax penitentiary is not just a physical shock. It is an absolute psychological slaughter. Bradley was assigned to a high-security facility in the barren desert, completely isolated from the luxurious life he once believed was his undeniable birthright. His custom-tailored Italian suits were permanently replaced by an abrasive, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that hung loosely over his rapidly deteriorating frame. He was no longer the arrogant financial director who commanded expensive boardrooms with a smug, polished smile. He was inmate 84792, a meaningless string of numbers in a violent concrete ecosystem where his Ivy League pedigree and his deep-seated racial superiority held absolutely zero currency. The prison hierarchy is a ruthless and primitive structure. White-collar criminals who embezzle corporate funds are generally ignored by the general population, but a man convicted of brutally assaulting an elderly woman is universally despised. The hardened inmates, the real monsters of the penal system, took one look at his crooked jaw and his cowardly, submissive demeanor and instantly placed him at the very bottom of the food chain. He was completely stripped of any basic human dignity. He spent his days scrubbing the filthy concrete floors of the communal showers with a small brush, his knees constantly aching on the hard, wet stone. He was terrified to sleep, constantly looking over his shoulder in the crowded, chaotic mess hall. But the true torture, the absolute masterpiece of his daily agonizing routine, was his mandatory prison labor assignment. Just as I had promised, he was permanently assigned to the prison industrial laundry facility. For 8 agonizing hours a day, he hauled heavy, soaking wet canvas bags of soiled uniforms through a humid, suffocating warehouse. He earned exactly 25 cents an hour for back-breaking labor that blistered his soft, uncalloused hands. And at the end of every single month, when the prison administration processed the meager payroll, every single shiny quarter he bled for was systematically garnished. He would receive his monthly commissary statement and stare at a balance of absolute zero, knowing perfectly well that his literal sweat was being directly deposited into my corporate accounts to pay off the massive $5 million syndicate debt I now legally owned. He was an absolute slave to the very man he had tried to destroy. His absolute isolation within those cold concrete walls was completely mirrored by the total eradication of his life on the outside. The young blonde mistress he had so arrogantly paraded around the city was the very first person to completely abandon his sinking ship. When the federal agents executed the seizure warrants, they did not just freeze Bradley corporate accounts, they aggressively clawed back every single asset purchased with my stolen logistics funds. The federal government seized the expensive downtown penthouse, forcing her out onto the street with nothing but a single suitcase of cheap clothes. They confiscated the luxury sports car he had bought her in cash, towing it away right in front of her furious, panicked eyes. The premium credit cards were instantly deactivated, and the lavish lifestyle she had been promised evaporated overnight into thin air. She did not stand by her wealthy sugar daddy in his time of absolute need. Instead, she eagerly cooperated with the federal prosecutors, trading every dirty secret she knew for a sweeping comprehensive immunity deal. In a final act of ultimate humiliation, she sent a legally monitored letter directly to his federal holding cell. The prison guards made sure to read it aloud to themselves before handing it to him. She did not offer words of comfort or empty promises to wait for his release. She cursed his name with absolute venom, detailing how he had ruined her life and explicitly stating that she hoped he rotted in that concrete cage forever. She informed him that she was already dating a younger, wealthier executive and warned him to never attempt to contact her again. Bradley was left sitting on his thin, rigid mattress, staring at the crumpled piece of paper, realizing that the fake love he had bought with my stolen money was completely worthless. He had sacrificed his marriage, his family, and his entire freedom for an absolute illusion. He was completely and utterly alone in the universe, with no one left to manipulate and absolutely nothing left to steal. While Bradley withered away in his dark concrete cell, my family was undergoing a massive, powerful rebirth. The judicial system moved with surprising efficiency when greased by the irrefutable digital evidence we had carefully provided. Camille finalized her absolute divorce decree, completely severing the legal parasite from her life for good. She did not ask for a single cent of alimony or a share of his non-existent frozen assets. She simply erased him from the legal record. Her very first act as a newly liberated woman was to march directly into the family court and officially petition to change my grandson's last name. The federal judge granted the request without a single moment of hesitation. Leo was no longer tied to the shameful criminal legacy of his biological father. He carried my last name now, a name entirely synonymous with resilience, unyielding strength, and absolute power. Camille herself underwent a profound transformation that made my chest swell with immense pride. She completely discarded the submissive, anxious persona that Bradley had so violently cultivated over the years. She stopped wearing the muted conservative colors he preferred and started dressing in sharp, commanding business attire. I did not just welcome her back into the warm family fold, I brought her directly into the towering glass headquarters of my logistics empire. I placed a heavy mahogany executive desk right next to my own in the master boardroom. I began the rigorous, unforgiving process of training my daughter to officially take my place as the chief executive officer. I taught her exactly how to read complex freight contracts, how to negotiate with ruthless shipping magnates, and how to spot a polished corporate predator from a mile away. She absorbed every single lesson with a fierce predatory hunger. She was no longer a naive pawn in a rich man game. She was a brilliant, highly capable executive learning how to properly wield the immense power of our multi-million-dollar family legacy. She looked at the massive empire I built from the dirt and finally understood the massive weight of the crown she was ultimately destined to wear. Corinne's physical and emotional recovery was the absolute greatest victory of all. Her fractured ribs had fully healed, and the dark, angry bruising on her beautiful face had faded into nothingness, leaving behind a resilient woman whose spirit remained completely unbroken by the violence she endured. She stood beside me in the grand hallway of our sprawling estate, her hand resting comfortably and securely in mine. We were looking directly at the heavy wooden door of the massive guest suite that Bradley had once arrogantly claimed as his private home office. I raised my hand and signaled to the private industrial demolition crew standing respectfully behind us, holding heavy steel sledgehammers and crowbars. Corinne offered a serene, beautiful smile and gave a small, deliberate nod of absolute approval. The crew stepped forward and violently smashed through the heavy oak door, tearing down the drywall and ripping the expensive custom shelving straight out of the wooden studs. We stood there together, listening to the deafening, satisfying sound of pure destruction, completely obliterating the very last physical trace of his miserable existence from our sacred sanctuary. I stand at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my top-floor executive office, looking down at the sprawling industrial shipping yard below. The sun is just beginning to rise over the city, casting a brilliant golden light across the dark asphalt. Below me, hundreds of heavy-duty transport trucks bearing my family logo roll smoothly through the automated security gates. They move in perfect synchronized order, hauling freight across the state lines, carrying the lifeblood of my massive logistics empire. The powerful rumble of their massive diesel engines vibrates faintly through the thick glass, a steady heartbeat of an enterprise that survived the ultimate betrayal. I watch the drivers perform their meticulous pre-trip inspections, completely unaware of the violent corporate war that was fought and won behind closed boardroom doors. The company is operating with unprecedented efficiency. The toxic dead weight has been entirely surgically removed. I turn away from the window and walk back to my heavy mahogany desk. My breathing is steady, my mind perfectly clear. The storm that threatened to drown my legacy has passed, leaving behind a fortress made of impenetrable steel. Camille sits at the desk adjacent to mine, fully engrossed in a complex regional shipping manifest. She looks sharp, confident, and completely in command of her new role as Chief Executive Officer. Her transition from a manipulated victim to a ruthless corporate titan is a masterpiece I am incredibly proud to witness. She signs a heavy stack of multi-million-dollar freight contracts with a heavy gold pen, her signature carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. The very company Bradley arrogantly tried to steal is now actively thriving under the direct command of the woman he thought he could so easily cast aside. I pour myself a hot cup of black coffee, taking a slow, deliberate sip as I survey the domain I built from dirt. The air in the executive suite smells like fresh ink and victory. There is no lingering shadow of the man who tried to break us. He is nothing more than a cautionary tale, a forgotten footnote in the long, victorious history of my family empire. The trucks keep moving, the revenue keeps flowing, and the heavy iron crown rests exactly where it belongs. People often misunderstand the true fundamental nature of immense wealth and power. They foolishly believe that a massive bank account automatically grants you total immunity from the dark, predatory nature of human greed. But building an empire from nothing teaches you a very different, brutal reality. Success does not shield you from parasites, it actively attracts them. They smell the success like blood in the water drawn by the illusion of easy comfort. For 40 years, I sacrificed my own blood, sweat, and youth to build an impenetrable fortress for the women I loved. I endured the freezing nights in a rusted truck cab, the racist sneers in elite boardrooms, and the bone-crushing fatigue of manual labor, so my family would never have to experience true vulnerability. But I learned a harsh, devastating lesson about the strict boundaries of unconditional love. You cannot simply love a predator into becoming a decent human being. You cannot offer enough financial comfort to satisfy a malignant narcissist. When you invite a toxic element into your sacred sanctuary, your passive kindness becomes your absolute greatest weakness. Protecting the pack requires significantly more than just providing a comfortable, luxurious home and signing generous checks. It requires the absolute willingness to commit acts of sheer, calculated ruthlessness when a threat emerges from within your own ranks. You have to be willing to burn down your own house to eradicate the infestation. You have to possess the chilling capacity to look a man who sits at your dinner table dead in the eye and systematically dismantle his entire existence without a single ounce of hesitation. A true patriarch does not just build the high walls of the castle, he actively patrols the outer perimeter with a loaded weapon ready to strike down anyone who dares to scale the gates. There is absolutely no room for forgiveness when a man physically assaults the mother of his wife. There is zero margin for grace when a man uses an innocent 5-year-old boy as a calculated hostage to execute a multi-million-dollar robbery. Society often preaches the virtue of turning the other cheek, of keeping family matters quiet and handling disputes with soft, diplomatic hands. I completely reject that cowardly philosophy. Mercy extended to a remorseless traitor is simply an open invitation for future violence. When you forgive a monster, you do not teach him compassion, you simply teach him that your boundaries are entirely negotiable. I did not negotiate with Bradley. I eradicated him from the face of the earth using the full crushing weight of the federal justice system and the absolute power of my own financial leverage. I made sure his punishment was not just physical incarceration but a permanent psychological destruction that will haunt him every single day he draws breath in that concrete cage. He will spend his life paying back the money he owes me quarter by shiny quarter. Family is the most sacred institution in the universe, but true family is not automatically guaranteed by blood or a signed marriage certificate. True family is an ironclad contract built entirely on mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and absolute trust. If a person violently breaches that contract, they instantly forfeit every single privilege of that relationship. They are no longer a son, a daughter, or a husband. They become an active enemy combatant. I protected my family by eliminating the enemy with extreme prejudice. I secured my legacy by demonstrating exactly what happens to anyone who dares to mistake my quiet patience for weakness. I demonstrated that the wealth I created serves two distinct purposes. It is a blanket of profound comfort for those who remain fiercely loyal, and a weapon of absolute mass destruction for those who attempt to cross me. I did not just defeat a greedy son-in-law, I sent a permanent warning shot to anyone who might ever think about targeting my bloodline. The message is simple and undeniable. The late afternoon sun casts long, warm shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn as I pull my heavy sedan into the driveway of my estate. The shattered glass and broken doors from that horrific night have been entirely replaced, erasing the very last physical memory of the violent intrusion. I walk through the front door and immediately feel the absolute profound peace radiating through the wide corridors. I find Corinne waiting for me on the back patio, her beautiful face glowing with total health and serene happiness. I take her hand in mine, our fingers intertwining exactly as they have for the past 40 years, and we walk slowly together beneath the cooling shade of the massive oak trees. The sound of joyful, bright laughter rings out across the green grass. My 5-year-old grandson Leo runs at full speed, wrapping his small arms tightly around my leg. I look down at his smiling, innocent face, and I know that the brutal war was entirely worth the heavy toll. Absolute justice has been completely served. The toxic infection has been permanently purged. My family is finally safe. The ultimate lesson I took from this entire ordeal is that true power is not measured by the size of the empire you build, but by your absolute willingness to defend it from those closest to you. We spend our lives building high walls to keep external enemies out, completely forgetting that the most dangerous predators are often the ones sitting right at our dinner table. Never let your love for your family blind you to the reality of their actions. True vigilance means being prepared to sever an infected limb to save the rest of the body. You must always trust your instincts over their polished lies. If you believe in protecting your family at all costs, hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute justice.